Round 'em up and head 'em off at the pass in this action-packed frontier western Ozark Devil. Press the subscribe button above so you don't miss a single adventure. Chapter 1. The sun hung like a brass coin over the Arkansas ridges when Eldridge Sample rode down into Cypress Hollow, trailing behind him a piece of human refuse that bore little resemblance to the man whose face graced the wanted poster folded in Sample's vest pocket. The captive's hands were bound tight to his saddle horn, and dried blood painted dark streaks down the side of his head where Sample's rifle butt had kissed him during their last disagreement about direction. Sample sat his horse with the stillness of a man who had learned patience in hard schools. His gray eyes, pale as winter ice, surveyed the single street that comprised the whole of Cypress Hollow's commercial district. 4 buildings squatted in the dust like monuments to frontier ambition gone sour. Murphy's livery stable with its sagging roof and weathered sign, Keller's general store whose windows were so begrimed a man couldn't see what lay within, the broken wheel saloon that leaned against its neighbor like a drunk seeking support, and at the far end, a 2-story structure whose fresh paint and lace curtains announced its purpose without need of a sign. What struck Sample most forcefully was not what he saw, but what he didn't see. For a town at midday, Cypress Hollow lay as quiet as a cemetery. No children played in the street, no women gossiped on porches, no men lounged in whatever shade they could find. The only movement came from a yellow dog that slunk between buildings with its tail tucked tight against its belly, as if it expected a kick from any direction. Sample's prisoner lifted his head with effort, spitting blood into the dust. "Told you this place weren't worth the trouble," Jake Motley mumbled through split lips. "Ain't nothing here but ghosts and fear." "Every place is worth the trouble when there's $100 riding on your worthless hide," Sample replied, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man accustomed to ending conversations before they started. He touched his heels to his horse's flanks and moved down the street at a walk that seemed casual but missed nothing. As they passed Murphy's livery, Sample caught sight of a face at the window, an old man with white whiskers and eyes wide as a spooked calf's. The face disappeared so quickly Sample might have imagined it, but the curtains still trembled in the airless afternoon. At Keller's store, the same performance repeated itself. A woman's pale features appeared and vanished like smoke, leaving only the memory of terror etched in the lines around her eyes. The saloon doors hung open in the heat, but no sound emerged from the dark interior. No piano music, no laughter, no clink of glasses or rattle of dice. Sample had seen livelier morgues. Even the comfort house at the street's end might have been abandoned for all the sign of life it showed, though Sample knew such establishments rarely closed their doors while the sun still shone. When they reached the jailhouse, a squat building of native stone that hunched between the saloon and general store like a toad in the dust, Sample dismounted with the fluid motion of a rider born to the saddle. His boots struck the earth without sound, and his hand never strayed far from the worn walnut grip of the Colt that rode his right hip. "Sheriff," he called, his voice carrying easily in the oppressive quiet. "Got some business needs tending." The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo from the surrounding hills, and a man emerged who made the doorframe look narrow. Sheriff Caleb Rook stood better than 6.5 feet in his boots, with shoulders that could have carried a yoke and hands the size of dinner plates. His black hair hung lank to his collar, and his eyes held the flat, reflective quality of a snake's gaze. The badge pinned to his vest looked small against his massive chest, but it caught what light there was and threw it back like a warning. "Marshal Sample," Rook said, and his voice rumbled up from somewhere deep in his barrel chest. "Heard you might be coming through our little settlement." His gaze fixed on the bound prisoner with what might have been recognition. "That there Jake Motley you got trussed up like a Christmas goose?" "It is," Sample confirmed. "Caught him 3 days north of here, trying to cross the Buffalo River with stolen horses and a dead rancher's gold in his saddlebags." He handed over the crumpled wanted poster. "Fort Smith's offering $100 for him," breathing, 50 if he ain't. Rook studied the poster with exaggerated care, though Sample suspected the man could have recited its contents from memory. Well now, that's right public-spirited of you, Marshal. But I'm afraid we got ourselves a problem. He gestured toward the jailhouse with one massive hand. Jail's full up right now. Had to lock up 3 drunken Cherokee and a horse thief just yesterday. Ain't got room for another guest. Sample's pale eyes narrowed slightly. In his experience, a frontier sheriff's jail was never full, and certainly not in a town as dead as Cypress Hollow appeared to be. That's so. Mind if I take a look for myself? Something flickered behind Rook's serpent gaze, irritation perhaps, or calculation. Now, Marshal, I surely do appreciate your dedication to duty, but there ain't no call to go doubting a fellow lawman's word. Tell you what, why don't you just take your prisoner on through to the next county? I'm sure Sheriff Davidson in Yellville would be happy to accommodate you. I'm sure he would, Sample agreed, his tone giving nothing away. But Motley's been on the trail hard for 3 days, and so have I. My horse needs rest, and I need a meal that don't come from a can. Figure we'll spend the night, head out fresh in the morning. The big sheriff's jaw worked as if he were chewing something tough. Well, if you're set on staying, I reckon Murphy can put you up in the livery. But I'll need to insist that prisoner of yours stays with me. Can't have dangerous men roaming free in a peaceful town like ours. Sample studied Rook's face with the intensity of a man reading sign on a difficult trail. Everything about the sheriff's manner set his nerves on edge. The 2 ready excuses, the obvious desire to see him gone, and most of all, the way the man's eyes kept shifting to Jake Motley as if measuring him for something other than a jail cell. Obliged for the concern, Sheriff, Sample said finally. But I'll keep charge of my prisoner until I can turn him over proper at Fort Smith. Man learns to sleep light in my profession. For just a moment Rook's mask slipped, and Sample glimpsed something beneath it that made his hand instinctively drift closer to his gun. Then the sheriff's broad face split in what passed for a smile, though it never reached his eyes. Suit yourself, Marshal. Just remember, we run a quiet town here in Cypress Hollow. Peaceful folk who don't take kindly to trouble. You'd do well to keep that in mind during your visit. The words carried a weight of meaning that settled over Sample like a cold wind. As he led his prisoner toward Murphy's livery, he could feel Rook's gaze boring into his back like a rifle sight. Whatever was wrong in Cypress Hollow ran deeper than an overcrowded jail, and Eldridge Sample had lived long enough to know that sometimes the badge was just another mask for the devil to hide behind. Chapter 2. The interior of Murphy's livery hung thick with the smell of hay, leather, and something else Sample couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or the sour scent of a man who sweated through too many sleepless nights. Patrick Murphy emerged from the shadows like a ghost given reluctant substance, his movements jerky as a marionette worked by an amateur's hand. "Marshal," Murphy whispered, though no other ears were present to overhear. His rheumy blue eyes darted toward the open door, then back to Sample's face, then away again, as if sustained eye contact might prove fatal. "Didn't expect. That is, we don't get many lawmen passing through." Sample noted how the old man's hands trembled as he reached for the reins of both horses. The tremor wasn't from age or infirmity. Sample had seen enough frightened men to recognize the particular shake that came from living under constant threat. Murphy's fingers bore old scars, and fresher bruises darkened the knuckles of his right hand. "Quiet town," Sample observed, securing Jake Motley's bonds to a sturdy post. His prisoner had lapsed into sullen silence, but his eyes remained alert, watching everything with the calculating attention of a man who made his living from other people's weaknesses. "Oh yes, very quiet," Murphy agreed too quickly. "Sheriff Rook, he keeps the peace real, thorough-like." The old man's voice cracked on the last word, and he busied himself with unnecessary adjustments to the horse's tack. Sample's gaze swept the livery's interior, cataloging details with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 3 years of war and 10 years of hunting men who killed for profit. The building was clean but showed signs of recent repairs: new boards in the wall, fresh plaster over what looked like bullet holes, and a suspiciously dark stain on the floor near the back stall that someone had tried hard to scrub away. "You do good work, Murphy," Sample said, running his hand along an expertly mended harness. "Man can tell you take pride in your trade." The compliment seemed to pain the old liveryman more than insult would have. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment Sample glimpsed the man Murphy had been before whatever had broken his spirit. "Used to," Murphy mumbled. "Used to take real pride. Had the finest stable between Little Rock and Fort Smith, back when." He trailed off, shaking his head as if to dislodge dangerous memories. "Back when?" Sample prompted gently. Murphy's eyes darted again toward the door. "Before Sheriff Rook came to appreciate my services so particular-like." The words carried a bitterness that made Sample's hand drift unconsciously toward his gun. "Man's got to make a living, you understand. Got to pay his taxes." The way Murphy said taxes made it clear he meant something else entirely. Sample had encountered protection rackets before, usually run by saloon owners or cattle barons who fancied themselves above the law. But a sheriff running such an operation represented a particularly vicious corruption of justice. "Heavy taxes in Arkansas?" Sample asked. "Oh yes," Murphy said, his laugh a broken sound like glass grinding underfoot. "Very heavy. Weekly collections, you might say. Sheriffs got to maintain law and order, and that costs money. Lots of money." A shadow fell across the livery's entrance, and Murphy's words died in his throat. Sample turned to see Sheriff Rook's massive frame blocking the doorway, his bulk reducing the afternoon sunlight to a dim glow around his edges. The sheriff stepped inside with surprising grace for such a large man, his boots making no sound on the straw-covered floor. "Murphy," Rook's voice filled the space like smoke from a green wood fire. "Hope you're taking good care of our distinguished visitor." "Yes, sir, Sheriff." "Yes, indeed. Best accommodations available." Murphy's servility was painful to witness, a proud man reduced to cowering before a predator in a badge. Rook's cold gaze fixed on Sample. "Marshal, I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About needing to keep charge of your prisoner." He moved closer, and Sample caught the smell of him, leather and sweat, and something metallic that might have been old blood. "Thing is, I got responsibilities to this town. Can't have dangerous criminals wandering loose, even in the custody of a fellow peace officer." "Motley's secured," Sample replied evenly. "Tied tight, and not going anywhere without my say-so." "Maybe so," Rook allowed, "but accidents happen. Ropes come loose, not slip. Then I got an armed desperado loose in my town, and that reflects poorly on my ability to maintain order." The sheriff's hand rested casually on his gun butt, a gesture that managed to seem both relaxed and threatening. "I'm going to have to insist that prisoner comes with me." Sample studied the big man's face, reading the calculation behind those serpent eyes. Rook wanted Jake Motley for reasons that had nothing to do with public safety, and everything to do with whatever corrupt enterprise he was running. The question was whether to force the issue now, or wait to see what the sheriff's true game might be. "Your town, your rules," Sample said finally. "But I'll be wanting him back first thing in the morning. Got a schedule to keep." Something like satisfaction flickered across Rook's brutal features. "Of course, Marshal. Wouldn't dream of delaying a federal officer in the performance of his duties." He moved toward Motley with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Come along, Jake. Time you got acquainted with Arkansas hospitality." As Rook untied the prisoner's bonds, Sample noticed how the sheriff's fingers lingered on the knots, testing their strength with the expertise of a man who had tied and untied many ropes in his time. Motley looked up at his new captor with an expression Sample couldn't quite read. Fear mixed with something else, perhaps recognition or even hope. "Sheriff?" Sample called as Rook herded his prisoner toward the door. "I'll be wanting to check on Motley's condition before we head out tomorrow. Make sure he's fit for travel." Rook paused in the doorway, his massive frame again blotting out the light. When he turned back, his smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Why, Marshal Sample, you don't trust me to take proper care of a prisoner? That wounds my professional pride." "Nothing personal, Sheriff. Just like to dot my I's and cross my T's." "Professional thoroughness. I can respect that in a lawman." Rook's voice carried an undertone that Sample didn't like. "You come by first thing in the morning, and we'll have your boy Jake all ready for the road." After they left, Murphy stood staring at the empty doorway, as if expecting devils to come pouring through it. His hands shook worse than before, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling air. "Murphy," Sample said quietly, "what's Sheriff Rook planning to do with my prisoner?" The old man's eyes went wide with terror. "I don't know nothing about the sheriff's business," he whispered. "Don't know, don't want to know, don't ask no questions." He backed away from Sample, as if the marshal carried some contagious disease. "You best not ask no questions either, if you know what's good for you." "And if I don't know what's good for me?" Murphy's gaze darted toward that dark stain on the floor, then back to Sample's face. "Then you might find yourself learning the hard way, just like Deputy Collins did 3 months back. Poor boy asked too many questions about the sheriff's bookkeeping." Murphy's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They found pieces of him scattered all through Devil's Den, what the bears didn't get." Sample felt ice form in his gut. A deputy asking questions about bookkeeping, then turning up dead in the wilderness. The pattern suggested Rook's corruption ran deeper than simple extortion. But before he could pursue the matter further, Murphy had melted back into the shadows of his stable, leaving Sample alone with his growing certainty that Jake Motley might not survive the night. As darkness settled over Cypress Hollow like a burial shroud, Sample checked his weapons and settled down to wait. Through the thin walls of the livery, he could hear the town's night sounds, or rather the absence of them. No music from the saloon, no laughter from the comfort house, no conversations drifting from porches where neighbors might gather to escape the day's heat. Just silence, and the soft scrape of his own boots as he moved to the window to watch the jailhouse across the street, where a single lamp burned behind barred windows, and Sheriff Rook was no doubt explaining to Jake Motley exactly what services the county expected in return for a chance at freedom. Sample's hand found the grip of his Colt, thumb resting on the hammer, as he settled in to watch and wait for whatever devil's bargain was about to unfold in the Arkansas darkness. Chapter 3. Sleep eluded Sample like a fugitive in familiar territory. He lay in the hayloft with his blanket spread over loose straw, watching moonlight filter through gaps in the stable roof while his ears strained for any sound that might signal trouble. Below him, the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, as if they too sensed the malevolent current that ran beneath Cypress Hollow's surface calm. Near midnight, when the town should have been dead to the world, Sample heard the first whisper of movement. Soft footsteps on hard-packed earth, the careful tread of someone moving with purpose through the darkness. He eased himself to the loft's edge and peered through a crack in the wall that gave him a view of the street. A figure emerged from the shadows between buildings, a woman wrapped in a dark shawl that made her nearly invisible against the night. She moved like smoke, flowing from one patch of darkness to another with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to avoiding unwanted attention. Sample watched her approach the jailhouse, pause at the door, then melt away again into the maze of alleys that connected Cypress Hollow's few buildings. 20 minutes later, she returned, this time carrying something in her hands. A covered pot, perhaps, or a bundle of cloth. Again she approached the jail, and this time Sample heard the soft creak of hinges as a door opened and closed. When she emerged, her hands were empty. Sample dressed silently in the darkness, pulling on his boots and checking his weapons with the automatic motions of long habit. Whatever game Sheriff Rook was playing with Jake Motley, it had attracted more players than just the two of them. The woman's midnight errand suggested a network of complicity that ran deeper than one corrupt lawman. He slipped from the loft like a ghost, moving through Murphy's stable with the sure-footed stealth he'd learned stalking Confederate pickets in the Tennessee hills. The old liveryman snored fitfully in his quarters at the back of the building, his sleep punctuated by muttered words that sounded like prayers or curses. The street lay empty under the pale moon, but Sample kept to the shadows anyway. He'd survived too many years of dangerous work to trust appearances, especially in a town where fear hung in the air like smoke from a smothered fire. Every darkened window might hide watching eyes. Every doorway could conceal an enemy. He circled wide around the jailhouse, approaching from the rear where a narrow alley separated the stone building from Keller's general store. Here the darkness was complete, broken only by thin slivers of lamplight that leaked through the jail's barred windows. Sample pressed himself against the cool stone wall and listened. Voices drifted through the night air, Rook's rumbling bass and another voice he didn't recognize, higher-pitched and urgent. Sample couldn't make out words, but the tone suggested negotiation, perhaps even argument. A third voice joined the conversation, this one unmistakably Jake Motley's nasal whine. Sample worked his way closer to the window, moving with infinite care to avoid scuffing his boots on the rocky ground. The voices grew clearer, though still muffled by stone walls and iron bars. "Won't be easy money," Motley was saying. "Man's quick as a rattler and twice as mean. Seen him put 3 bullets in a silver dollar at 50 paces. Speed don't matter if a man don't see the knife coming," Rook replied. "You get close enough, stick him proper, and your troubles are over. My troubles too. And if I miss? If he gets that gun out before I can finish him? Then you die stupid instead of living smart. Your choice, Jake." Sample pressed closer to the window, angling his head to catch a glimpse of the interior. Through the bars he could see lamplight flickering off stone walls and the iron doors of 3 cells. 2 men stood in the narrow corridor between the cells, Rook's massive bulk unmistakable even in the dim light, and a smaller figure that had to be the mysterious third voice. "Deputy Hawkins will leave your cell door unlocked when he brings breakfast," the smaller man was saying. "Marshal Sample always rises early, likes to check his horse and gear before the day gets hot. You'll have maybe 10 minutes while he's alone in the stable." Sample felt his blood turn to ice water. The trap was more elaborate than he'd suspected, involving not just Rook but his deputy, and God knew who else. The woman who'd visited the jail was probably part of it too, perhaps carrying messages or supplies for the planned ambush. "What about afterwards?" Motley asked. "Man kills a federal marshal. That brings attention no one wants." "Leave that to me," Rook said. "Official story will be you tried to escape, killed the marshal in the process, then died attempting to flee. Clean and simple, no loose ends." "Except me," Motley pointed out. Rook's laugh was like stones grinding in a mill. "Jake, you always were too smart for your own good. Don't start getting stupid now." The smaller man, Deputy Hawkins presumably, shifted nervously in the lamplight. "Sheriff, you sure this is the only way? Marshal seems like a reasonable enough fellow. Maybe if we just explained about the arrangements, he'd see fit to move along without causing trouble." "Billy, you got the backbone of a jellyfish," Rook growled. Man like Sample don't get reasonable when he smells corruption. He gets curious, starts asking questions, poking around where he don't belong. Next thing you know, we got federal marshals crawling all over the county, and our little enterprise goes straight to hell. But killing a marshal ain't killing if it's self-defense, Rook cut him off. Jake here tries to escape. Marshal tries to stop him. Both men die in the struggle. Tragic, but understandable. Won't be the first time a prisoner got desperate and took a lawman with him. Sample had heard enough. He eased away from the window, his mind already working out the angles of the trap they'd set for him. The plan was simple, but effective. Use Motley as a weapon, then dispose of him immediately afterward. No witnesses, no complications. Just another dead marshal who'd gotten too close to something he shouldn't have seen. But Rook had made one critical mistake in his calculations. Sample hadn't survived the war, and 10 years of hunting killers by walking blindly into obvious traps. The sheriff's elaborate scheme assumed Sample would follow his usual routine, making himself vulnerable at a predictable time and place. Instead, Sample intended to turn the trap around on the trappers. He ghosted through the darkness toward the rear of the buildings that faced the main street, looking for another way to gather intelligence about Rook's network. The woman who'd visited the jail had come from somewhere, and her midnight errand suggested she was more than a casual participant in the sheriff's schemes. Behind Keller's general store, Sample found what he was looking for: a narrow staircase leading to a second-floor apartment where a single candle burned behind a curtained window. He climbed the stairs with infinite care, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. At the top, he pressed his ear to the thin door and listened. Inside, 2 women were talking in hushed voices, their words barely audible through the wood. "Told you this would happen eventually," one was saying. "Rook's gotten too bold, too greedy. Sooner or later, someone was bound to come looking." "What choice did we have?" the second woman replied, and Sample recognized the voice from his glimpse of the midnight visitor. "He's got us all over a barrel. Pay his tax or lose everything. Resist him and end up like poor Collins. There's got to be another way. This marshal, maybe he could help us if we told him the truth about what's been happening here." "Help us?" The first woman's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "Sarah, you seen what happens to folks who cross Caleb Rook. You want to end up scattered through Devil's Den like Collins? Or maybe you'd prefer what happened to the Morrison girl." "Don't," Sarah whispered. "Don't speak of that. Then don't speak of getting help from some federal marshal who'll be dead by sunrise. We keep our heads down, pay what Rook demands, and maybe we live to see another day. That's the only choice we got." Sample heard the scrape of a chair, footsteps crossing the floor. He descended the stairs quickly, his boots making no sound on the worn boards. Behind him, the candle was snuffed out, plunging the apartment into darkness. As he made his way back toward Murphy's stable, Sample's mind cataloged everything he'd learned. Rook's corruption wasn't limited to simple extortion. There'd been at least 2 murders, including something involving a young woman that had left the townspeople too terrified to even speak of it directly. The sheriff had built a network of fear so complete that even when offered potential salvation, the victims chose continued submission over the risk of resistance. But most importantly, Sample now knew exactly what Rook planned for him and when the attack would come. The sheriff expected to face a victim. Instead, he'd be meeting a man who turned the tables on better killers than Jake Motley. Sample settled back into his position in the hayloft, but this time he wasn't waiting for dawn. He was preparing for war, and by the time the sun rose over Cypress Hollow, Sheriff Caleb Rook was going to learn that some traps caught more than their makers bargained for. In the distance, a night bird called once, its cry echoing off the surrounding hills like a warning that death was coming to Arkansas on swift and silent wings. Chapter 4. Breakfast, Jake, Deputy Billy Hawkins called through the iron bars, his voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Steam rose from the tin plate he balanced in his sweating palms, beans and hardtack from the broken wheel, the same slop that passed for nourishment throughout Cypress Hollow's handful of establishments. Jake Motley stirred on his narrow cot, chains rattling, as he sat up and fixed the deputy with eyes that held the calculating gleam of a man who sensed opportunity in another's weakness. "Billy boy, ain't you looking peaked this morning? Like a man who ain't slept too good." Hawkins fumbled with the heavy ring of keys, his hands betraying the nervous energy that coursed through his slight frame. He was young, maybe 25, with the soft look of someone who'd taken a badge more for the steady pay than any calling to law enforcement. His pale mustache twitched as he worked the lock, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool air that drifted through the jailhouse windows. "Sleep fine," Hawkins muttered, though dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. "Better than you will tonight, I reckon." Motley chuckled, the sound dry as autumn leaves scraping across stone. "Now that's where you're wrong, deputy. Way I see it, tonight I'll be sleeping under stars instead of behind bars. Free as a bird, and twice as smart." The cell door swung open with a screech of protesting hinges that seemed to echo through the building's stone walls. Hawkins stepped inside, plate extended, but his eyes wouldn't meet those of his prisoner. Instead, his gaze darted to the corridor, to the front door, anywhere but the face of the man he was about to set loose on murder. "Sheriff says you understand the arrangement," Hawkins whispered, setting the plate on the rickety table that served as Motley's only furniture. "Says you know what needs doing." Motley reached for the food with hands that remained steady, despite his chains. "Oh, I understand plenty, Billy boy. Question is, do you? 'Cause once this business gets started, ain't no backing out. Blood's like wine. Once you get a taste, it changes a man permanent like." The deputy's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Sheriff's got it all planned out. Simple and clean, no complications." "Simple," Motley repeated, spooning beans into his mouth without taking his eyes off Hawkins. "Man thinks killing a federal marshal is simple. He's either real stupid or real desperate. Which one's your Sheriff Rook?" Before Hawkins could answer, boot heels rang against the jailhouse floor. Sheriff Rook appeared in the corridor like a dark mountain given human form, his massive presence seeming to absorb what little light filtered through the barred windows. He filled the narrow space between cells with the easy confidence of a predator in familiar territory. "Billy, you delivering breakfast or proposing marriage?" Rook's voice carried the edge of a man whose patience wore thin as worn leather. "Got things to discuss with our guest here." Hawkins practically scurried from the cell, keys jangling like wind chimes in a storm. Rook watched him go with the contemptuous amusement of a man observing a trained dog perform tricks, then turned his attention to Motley with the focused intensity of a hawk studying a field mouse. "Sleep well, Jake." The sheriff's question carried layers of meaning, none of them particularly friendly. "Like a baby in his mama's arms," Motley replied around a mouthful of beans. "Dreaming sweet dreams about freedom and fresh air." Rook stepped into the cell, his bulk making the cramped space seem even smaller. The iron door remained open behind him, an invitation or a threat depending on interpretation. Dreams are fine things, but they don't put food in a man's belly or money in his pocket. Reality's got sharper teeth. Motley set down his spoon and leaned back against the stone wall, studying the sheriff with the wary attention of one predator recognizing another. "Reality's what we make it, Sheriff. Man's got the will and the skill. He can bend circumstances to his liking." "That's so." Rook's smile held all the warmth of a grave in winter. "Well then, Seems like you got yourself some circumstances need bending. Marshal Sample's been asking questions, poking around where curiosity ain't healthy. Man like that's got to be discouraged before his nosiness spreads to places it don't belong. The outlaw's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or anticipation. Discouragement's a specialty of mine, Sheriff. Always been good with my hands, even better with a blade. Question is, what's in it for Jake Motley? Rook reached into his vest and withdrew a folded paper. Motley's wanted poster, now creased and worn from handling. With deliberate slowness, he tore it in half, then quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like dead leaves. Your past disappears, Jake. Clean slate, fresh start, whatever name you choose to wear. All you got to do is solve one small problem for the county. Small problem that happens to wear a federal badge and shoots straighter than Sunday church service, Motley observed. Man doesn't take on Eldridge Sample without considerable motivation. The sheriff's hand drifted to his gun butt, fingers drumming against the worn leather holster. Motivation's what separates the living from the dead, Jake. You want to keep breathing Arkansas air, you'll find plenty of motivation to handle Marshal Sample permanent-like. Motley rose from his cot with fluid grace, chains singing softly as he moved. Despite his restraints, he carried himself with the balanced poise of a man accustomed to violence. And after, assuming I managed to put the marshal in the ground without getting myself killed in the process. After, you ride out of Cypress Hollow, a free man with $100 in your pocket, and my personal guarantee that no lawman in 3 counties will give you trouble. Rook's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than a shout. But if you try to double-cross me, if you even think about warning Sample or running off without finishing the job, I'll hunt you down myself and show you what real pain looks like. The 2 men faced each other in the narrow cell, the air between them crackling with the tension of a thunderstorm about to break. Outside, the town of Cypress Hollow continued its fearful silence, but inside the jailhouse, darker forces were aligning themselves for murder. When? Motley asked simply. Sample's got habits like all men. Rises early, checks his horse, goes through his gear methodical-like. Dawns when he's most predictable, least likely to have company. Rook pulled a knife from his boot, a wicked blade with a handle wrapped in leather cord. Billy will forget to lock your cell. Accident, you understand. Regrettable oversight that gives you maybe 10 minutes before anyone notices. Motley tested the knife's edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood that beaded bright red in the lamplight. 10 minutes is plenty, assuming Sample don't get lucky with that colt of his. Luck's got nothing to do with it, Rook said. Man's got to see trouble coming to react to it. You get close enough before he knows you're there, speed won't matter. The outlaw balanced the knife in his palm, feeling its weight and balance with the expertise of someone who'd used such tools before. And if someone hears the ruckus, comes running to investigate, won't be anyone to hear. Whole town knows to mind their own business when the sheriff's handling official matters. Rook's smile was all predator, no warmth. Besides, accidents happen all the time when desperate men try to escape. Tragic, but unavoidable. Motley slipped the knife inside his shirt, the blade disappearing against his ribs like it had found a familiar resting place. Reckon we got ourselves an understanding, Sheriff. Jake Motley's got no love for federal marshals, and even less for the inside of jail cells. Knew you were a reasonable man, Jake. Rook backed toward the cell door, his hand never straying far from his gun. Billy will be along with your evening meal around sunset. That's when the door gets left open by mistake. After that, you got maybe 6 hours before Sample starts his morning routine. The sheriff paused in the doorway, his bulk blocking the corridor beyond. Oh, and Jake, don't disappoint me. I'd hate to have to explain to your relatives How you died trying to escape." "Ain't got no relatives left alive to worry about," Motley replied. "But I appreciate the concern, Sheriff. Shows you got a heart under all that badge and bluster." Rook's laughter boomed through the jailhouse as he walked away, leaving Motley alone with his chains, his knife, and his murderous intentions. The outlaw settled back on his cot and closed his eyes, but his mind was already working through the mechanics of killing a man who'd made his living by staying one step ahead of death. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Cypress Hollow, its light falling on a town where fear had become a way of life, and corruption wore a badge. But in Murphy's stable across the street, Eldridge Sample was making preparations of his own, cleaning his weapons with the methodical care of a man who knew that dawn would bring either justice or death to the Arkansas hills. The pieces were in motion now, set in their courses like planets spinning toward collision. By the time the sun rose again over Cypress Hollow, either a corrupt sheriff would have eliminated the last threat to his empire of fear, or the devil would finally meet his match in a federal marshal who'd learned long ago that survival sometimes required becoming more dangerous than the men you hunted. Motley opened his eyes and smiled, the expression holding all the warmth of a snake's grin, as he began counting the hours until darkness fell and murder walked the streets of Cypress Hollow on silent feet. Chapter 5. "Hold still, you contrary beast," Sample murmured to his bay gelding, running practiced hands down the animal's legs in the pre-dawn darkness. The horse nickered softly, as if sensing the tension that coiled through its master's frame like a loaded spring. Beyond the stable walls, Cypress Hollow lay wrapped in the peculiar silence that comes just before sunrise, when the night creatures have finished their hunting and the day shift hasn't yet begun its labors. Sample had positioned himself with military precision, choosing a spot in the stable that offered multiple escape routes while keeping his back to solid timber. His Colt hung loose in its holster, and a second gun, a short-barreled .44 he'd taken off a dead bushwhacker near Vicksburg, rested tucked behind his belt where eager fingers could find it quick. The Winchester lay within arm's reach, propped against a support beam like a steel and walnut promise of death. Footsteps whispered across the hard-packed earth outside, soft as a ghost's passage, but not quite silent enough to fool ears trained by 3 years of war and a decade of hunting men who killed for pleasure. Sample's hands never paused in their work on the horse's harness, but every muscle in his body drew taut as piano wire. The stable door creaked on leather hinges, admitting a slice of gray dawn light and a shadow that moved with the fluid grace of a born killer. Jake Motley slipped inside like smoke-given substance, his freed hands carrying a knife that gleamed dull silver in the gloom. The blade was military issue, a Confederate Arkansas toothpick with a point sharp enough to part silk and an edge that could open a man from belt to backbone. "Morning, Marshal," Motley said conversationally, as if they were meeting for coffee instead of murder. "Mighty early to be tending livestock." Sample straightened slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Horse needs attention, same as any living thing. Neglect what depends on you, and it'll fail when you need it most." His pale eyes fixed on Motley's face, reading the killer's intent in the set of his shoulders and the way his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. "Surprised to see you walking free, Jake. Thought Sheriff Rook was particular about security." Motley's grin was all teeth and malice. "Man gets careless sometimes. Deputy Hawkins, he forgot to turn that key proper like. Regrettable oversight, you might say." "Regrettable," Sample agreed. The bay gelding sensed the approaching violence and sidestepped nervously, iron shoes ringing against stone. "Question is, what's a freed man doing visiting my horse instead of putting distance between himself and a federal warrant?" The killer took another step into the stable, the knife weaving lazy patterns through the air like a steel snake testing for weakness. "Well now, Marshal, that's where things get interesting. See, I got myself a business proposition that requires your immediate attention." Sample's hand drifted toward his gun with the casual motion of a man scratching an itch. "I'm listening." "Sheriff Rook, he's got himself a problem with nosy federal officers poking around where they ain't wanted. Man like that needs solutions, not complications." Motley's voice carried the conversational tone of a rattlesnake's warning buzz. "So he made me an offer, solve his problem permanent-like, and Jake Motley rides out of Arkansas a free man with gold in his pocket." "Generous of him," Sample observed. "Course, there's a flaw in that particular plan." Motley's eyes narrowed to slits. "What flaw would that be?" "You're assuming I'm fool enough to let you get close with that pig sticker." The words were barely out of Sample's mouth when Motley exploded into motion, covering the distance between them in 3 quick strides with the knife rising toward the marshal's ribs. But Sample had been waiting for exactly that move, and his response came with the fluid precision of long practice. His left hand swept up to catch Motley's wrist, deflecting the blade's thrust while his right found the Colt's grip with the speed of a striking hawk. The gun cleared leather in a motion too quick for the eye to follow, flame and thunder erupting from its muzzle as Sample put a bullet through Motley's heart at point-blank range. The killer's forward momentum carried him another step before his legs folded like a house of cards in a windstorm. He hit the stable floor with a sound like a sack of grain dropping from a height, the Arkansas toothpick spinning away into the shadows as his nerveless fingers lost their grip. Sample stood over the body, smoke curling from his Colt's barrel while the gelding danced and snorted at the sudden violence. Motley's eyes stared sightlessly at the stable roof, his mouth frozen in an expression of surprise that would last until the grave claimed him. "Should have taken the sheriff's advice about speed not mattering," Sample said to the corpse. "Trouble is, you still got to get close enough to use that blade." Heavy footsteps pounded across the street, Sheriff Rook running toward the sound of gunfire with Deputy Hawkins stumbling along behind like a dog following its master. Sample holstered his Colt and stepped back from Motley's body, assuming the stance of a man who just defended himself against a desperate prisoner. Rook burst through the stable door with his gun drawn and his massive frame blocking most of the entrance. His serpent eyes took in the scene, Motley's corpse, the knife lying in the straw, Sample standing calm as a preacher at Sunday service. For just a moment, the sheriff's mask slipped enough to show the calculation beneath. "What happened here?" Rook demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Your prisoner tried to escape," Sample replied evenly. "Must have picked the lock somehow, then came looking for weapons or a horse. When I tried to stop him, he pulled that knife and made his play." Deputy Hawkins appeared at Rook's shoulder, his face pale as milk and twice as sour. The young man's eyes darted between the corpse and his superior's face, reading volumes in the sheriff's barely controlled fury. "Regrettable," Rook said, echoing Motley's earlier words. "Man gets desperate. He's liable to try anything. Lucky you were armed, Marshal, or we might be looking at 2 bodies instead of 1. Sample's pale gaze never wavered from the sheriff's face. "Lucky," he agreed. "Though I notice your security seems to have some gaps in it. Men like Motley don't usually slip locks without help." The accusation hung in the air between them, like smoke from a green wood fire. Rook's hand tightened on his gun grip, knuckles showing white against the leather, while Hawkins looked like he wanted to disappear into the stable's shadows. "Accidents happen," Rook said finally. "Billy here's still learning the finer points of his duties. Ain't that right, Deputy?" Hawkins nodded so vigorously, Sample half expected his head to fall off. "Yes, sir, Sheriff. Still learning. Won't happen again." "See that it don't," Rook growled. He holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance, then fixed Sample with a stare that promised future complications. "I'll have the undertaker collect the body. No need for you to trouble yourself with the details, Marshal. Sample bent to retrieve Motley's knife, testing its edge against his thumb before sliding it into his boot. Evidence, he explained when Rook's eyes narrowed. Case there's questions from Fort Smith about how their prisoner came to die. The sheriff's jaw worked like he was chewing something tough and bitter. Course. Proper procedure and all. Though I can't imagine Judge Parker will lose much sleep over Jake Motley's passing. Judge Parker's particular about documentation, Sample replied. Man likes his paperwork complete and his facts straight. Can't say I blame him. Rook turned toward the door, then paused as if struck by sudden inspiration. Tell you what, Marshal. Since you've had such excitement this morning, why don't you plan on staying another day? Let things settle down. Make sure there ain't no more trouble brewing. The invitation carried all the warmth of a hangman's noose, but Sample nodded as if he'd been offered genuine hospitality. Obliged for the concern, Sheriff. Though I expect I'll be moving on this morning as planned. Got business in Fort Smith that won't wait. Business, Rook repeated, the word carrying implications that made Hawkins shift nervously beside him. Well, if you change your mind about staying, you know where to find me. The sheriff stalked from the stable, with his deputy trailing behind like a whipped cur. Sample watched them cross the street toward the jailhouse, noting how Rook's shoulders remained rigid with barely controlled rage. The trap had failed, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. If anything, Sample's survival had likely escalated whatever game the corrupt sheriff was playing. Sample turned back to his horse, resuming his interrupted preparations for departure. But his ears remained alert for any sound that might signal fresh trouble, and his gun hand stayed loose and ready. Jake Motley was dead, but the snake that had sent him still carried plenty of venom, and Eldridge Sample had learned long ago that wounded predators were the most dangerous kind of all. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Cypress Hollow, its light falling on a town where the balance of power had shifted with a single gunshot, and where a federal marshal had just declared war on corruption without speaking a word of challenge aloud. Chapter 6. The shadows of late afternoon stretched long and sinister across the dusty, forsaken street of Cypress Hollow, painting the crude facades of its few establishments with a melancholy, odorous light. Deputy Billy Hawkins, his youthful face a mask of haggard dread, carried Sheriff Caleb Rook's evening meal, a tin plate of greasy beans and stringy salt pork covered by a stained cloth from the Broken Wheel Saloon. Each step toward the squat stone jailhouse felt as though his boots were cast in lead, his heart a frantic bird trapped within the cage of his ribs. The very air in Cypress Hollow seemed to whisper Rook's name, a sibilant chorus of fear that eddied in the dust devils dancing before the dying sun. Billy's hand, slick with nervous sweat, trembled as he fumbled with the heavy iron latch of the jailhouse door. The interior was little more than a dim, malodorous cavern, the fading daylight struggling to penetrate the grime-caked, narrow windows. Rook, a hulking silhouette against the weak light from his cell's barred opening, sat upon his cot like some great, brooding beast of prey. He had been incarcerated by Marshal Sample that morning, a turn of events that had sent shivers of both terror and a strange, forbidden hope through the oppressed town. But hope was a fragile thing in Cypress Hollow, easily crushed under the heel of a man like Rook. "Took you long enough, Billy," Rook's voice rumbled, the sound less a query than a threat wrapped in coarse velvet. "A man could starve waiting on your services." Billy flinched, his gaze darting about the small office before settling reluctantly on the sheriff. "Sorry, Sheriff." Saloon was slow. He approached the cell, the clink of his spurs unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Rook's eyes, black and cold as obsidian chips, fixed upon him. Even disarmed and imprisoned, the sheriff radiated an aura of brutal authority that Billy had never learned to withstand. He watched the deputy's fumbling attempts to manage the plate and the cell keys, a sneer twisting his thick lips. Food smells rank, Billy. Like your courage. Rook shifted, the cot groaning under his immense weight. But then, courage ain't what I expect from you. Just obedience. Billy placed the plate on the small shelf outside the bars. His hand shook so violently that beans sloshed over the side. Marshal Sample said to make sure you was fed. Rook chuckled, a dry, rasping sound devoid of humor. Sample. Yes, the good Marshal. So righteous. So temporary. He leaned forward, his massive hands gripping the bars, the knuckles white. You know, Billy, this town, this badge, they mean something to me. My arrangements. My security. His voice dropped, becoming a venomous purr. And you, Billy, you're part of that security. Or you're a liability. The deputy swallowed, his throat clicking. I do what you say, Sheriff. Always have. Not always, Billy. Not when that tin star outsider had you quacking in your boots this morning. Saw it in your eyes. Thinking maybe your troubles were over. Rook's gaze was hypnotic, a predator's stare that pinned Billy to the spot. My troubles ain't over. Which means yours are just beginning, unless you make a choice. A coward's choice, maybe. But the smart one. Billy's heart hammered. He knew this tone. It was the precursor to pain, to demands that scraped at the very marrow of his soul. What do you want, Sheriff? Want? Rook's laugh was short and ugly. I want out, Billy. Simple as that. And you're gonna give it to me. I can't. Billy stammered, stepping back. Marshal Sample, he'd know. He'd come after me. After you. Sample, Rook spat the name like a curse. Sample's just one man. And he'll be dealt with. But you, Billy, you live here. You got roots here. He paused, letting the silence stretch, then continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying softness. Pretty wife you got, Billy. Sarah, ain't it? Saw her down by the creek last spring, hair shinin' in the sun. Delicate thing. A cold dread, sharper than any fear Billy had known, pierced through him. Don't you talk about her. Rook's grip on the bars tightened, his shoulders bunching. And the little one, yea. What is it now, 6 months old? A boy, I hear. Healthy. Screamin' little lungs on him, I bet. The sheriff's eyes glittered with a sickening light. Babies are fragile, Billy. Awful fragile. A man has to be so careful with them. Wouldn't want him to catch a chill. Or worse. Billy's breath hitched. Tears of impotent rage and terror welled in his eyes. You wouldn't. Even you. Wouldn't I? Rook's voice was a silken rasp, each word a separate drop of poison. Think about it, Billy. A dark night. A window left unlatched. A small cry, quickly muffled. No one would hear. No one would know. Just a grieving father and a distraught mother. He described, with chilling, graphic precision, the kind of harm that could befall a tender babe, the kind of sorrow that could break a woman like Sarah. He spoke of small hands growing cold, of a cradle left shockingly empty. The images Rook painted exploded in Billy's mind, visceral and unbearable. He saw Sarah's face, pale with unimaginable grief, her eyes accusing him. He heard the phantom wail of his infant son. His stomach churned, and the world seemed to tilt. The tin plate clattered from his nerveless fingers, its contents spilling across the dusty floor. No, Billy whispered, the word a ragged exhalation of pure agony. He covered his face with his hands, great, shuddering sobs tearing through him. The shame was a branding iron against his soul, searing him with the knowledge of his own spinelessness, his utter inability to protect those he loved from this monster. Yet the monster held all the cards. That key, Billy, Rook said, his voice returning to its cold, commanding tone, the earlier graphic detail replaced by curt instruction. The one on the end of the ring. Open this door. Now. Slowly, with the movements of a man climbing his own scaffold, Billy Hawkins lowered his hands. His face was a ruin, streaked with tears and dirt, his eyes hollowed by despair. He looked at the ring of keys, then at Rook, then at the floor. The choice was no choice at all. It was surrender, absolute and soul-shattering. His sobbing subsided into broken, jerky breaths. With trembling fingers, he selected the key. The metal felt cold, alien in his palm. Each step toward the cell door was an act of profound self-loathing. The key slid into the lock, the tumblers grating with a sound that echoed the breaking of his own spirit. The heavy bolt shot back with a sickening thud. Rook pushed the door inward, the screech of its hinges a sound of grim triumph. He stepped out of the cell, his massive frame seeming to swell, to fill the cramped office with an even more potent menace now that he was unrestrained. He looked down at the still trembling deputy, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, contempt, perhaps, or a perverse satisfaction. "You did good, Billy," Rook said, his voice almost gentle. He placed a heavy hand on Billy's shoulder. Billy looked up, a spark of desperate, pathetic hope igniting in his chest. Maybe Rook would spare him. Maybe the nightmare was over. "Sheriff." Rook's other hand came up with shocking speed. It clamped around Billy's throat, fingers like iron bands cutting off his airway. Billy's eyes widened in stunned terror, his hands flying up to claw at Rook's wrist. But the sheriff's grip was unbreakable. With a swift, brutal wrench, Rook twisted. There was a sharp, sickening crack, like dry timber snapping. Deputy Billy Hawkins went limp, his body slumping, a puppet with its strings cut. Rook held him for a moment longer, then let him drop. Billy's corpse crumpled to the floor in a heap, his head lolling at an unnatural angle, sightless eyes staring up at the grimy ceiling. Rook looked down at the body for a long moment, his face impassive. "Loyalty," he grunted, the word a final, cruel epitaph. He then moved with surprising quickness for a man his size, retrieving his gun belt from the office desk where Sample had left it. He checked the Colt revolver, then strapped it around his thick waist. He took a moment, his back to the fallen deputy, arranging the scene just so, a dark satisfaction in his movements. He dragged Billy's body slightly, positioning it near the center of the room, a fallen lawman in his own jail. The last rays of the setting sun cast a bloody glow through the western window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the still pale face of the murdered deputy. Rook gave the room one last cursory glance. He then stepped out into the encroaching darkness of Cypress Hollow, a freed devil ready to reclaim his tainted kingdom, leaving Billy Hawkins's cooling body as a grim discovery for Marshal Sample. The silence that descended upon the jailhouse was profound, broken only by the drip of grease from the overturned plate onto the stone floor, a lonely sound in a chamber of betrayal and death. Chapter 7. A sliver of moon, like a tarnished sickle, shed a ghostly luminescence over Cypress Hollow as Eldridge Sample moved with the silent purpose of a wolf through the deserted street. The air, thick with the scent of dust and despair, carried no sound save the distant, mournful cry of a hunting owl. He had waited, a sentinel in the shadowed livery, sensing the wrongness that coiled around the town like a sleeping rattler. Rook's earlier bravado after Motley's death, his thinly veiled invitation for Sample to remain, had been too insistent, too charged with an unspoken agenda. His instincts, honed by years where a misread sign meant a shallow grave, now screamed a warning. The jailhouse stood squat and dark, a tombstone against the pale wash of the night sky. No lamp glowed in its window, a departure from the previous night that pricked at Sample's attention. He approached the jail with his Colt already drawn, the walnut grip familiar and reassuring in his hand. The front door was slightly ajar, a black gash in the stone face of the building. Sample pushed it inward with the barrel of his gun, the faint creak of the hinges seeming to echo in the profound stillness. The office was steeped in shadow, the air metallic and cloying. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it, a crumpled shape on the floor near the center of the room. Deputy Billy Hawkins lay in a grotesque sprawl, his neck at an impossible angle, vacant eyes staring up at the cobweb-laced ceiling. The spilled contents of a tin plate lay nearby, beans and greasy meat congealing in the dust. Sample knelt, his gaze sweeping the scene, missing nothing. The snapped neck was a brutal, efficient piece of work, the hallmark of a powerful man who killed without compunction. Rook. There was no doubt. The empty cell, its door hanging open, confirmed it. The sheriff's gun belt was gone from the desk. A cold, hard anger, devoid of heat but potent as frozen steel, settled in Sample's chest. Hawkins had been a weak man, a pawn in Rook's corrupt game, but he hadn't deserved this. His terror, his fumbling incompetence had been a shield for Rook, and Rook had rewarded that terrified loyalty with a swift, contemptuous death. This was not merely an escape, it was a statement, a final act of savage dominion over the town and its people. Sample rose, his mind already sifting through the implications. Rook wouldn't just flee. A man like that, cornered and exposed, would retreat to ground he knew, to a place where he held the advantage. The stories Murphy had whispered in the livery, the hushed, fearful talk of Devil's Den, and the wild, untamed backcountry, coalesced into a grim certainty. He spent a few moments outside, his senses attuned to the language of the night. The ground near the jailhouse was hard-packed and scuffed by many feet, but Rook was a large man, and his escape, likely made in haste, would leave traces. Sample circled wider, his eyes scanning the earth like a scholar reading ancient script. Near the alley that ran behind Keller's store, he found them, the deep, clear impressions of heavy boots, unmistakable in the faint moonlight. They pointed away from the hollow, angling north by northwest, toward the rugged spine of the Ozark ridges that reared against the stars like the jagged teeth of some colossal beast. The trail was fresh, hours old at most. Rook had a head start, but he was on foot, and the country he was entering was no place for a casual stroll. It was a wilderness primeval, a labyrinth of stone and shadow that had swallowed men whole and left no trace. Sample returned to the livery, the image of Billy Hawkins's lifeless form seared into his mind. He gathered his meager supplies, his Winchester, a box of cartridges, a canteen, the knife he'd taken from Motley, and a length of rope. His bay gelding, sensing the grim purpose in his master, nickered softly. "Not this time, old friend," Sample murmured, stroking the horse's muzzle. "This is a man's work, on foot." The terrain Rook was heading into would be too rough for a horse, too close, too dangerous for anything but stealth and a hunter's instinct. As the first hint of gray began to dilute the blackness of the eastern sky, Sample stood at the edge of Cypress Hollow, the last vestiges of the wretched little town behind him. Before him, the Ozark wilderness loomed, a vast, brooding expanse of tangled forest, razorback ridges, and deep-shadowed hollows. The air that drifted down from those heights was cooler, smelling of damp earth, pine, and something ancient, almost feral. The tracks led directly towards what the locals called the Devil's Backbone, a treacherous escarpment that snaked its way into the deepest, most formidable part of the mountains. This was country where the very rock seemed to twist into tormented shapes, where sinkholes opened like maws to swallow the unwary, and hidden caverns honeycombed the earth beneath. It was whispered that these same remote valleys and subterranean passages had been the last stronghold of Cherokee warriors, men who had fought to the bitter end rather than surrender their ancestral lands, their ghosts now woven into the fabric of the place. Sample knew he was walking into Rook's territory now, the man's sanctuary. Here, the badge Caleb Rook had so defiled meant nothing. Here, the only law was the law of survival, the swift justice of fang and claw, or a well-aimed bullet. Rook would be like a bear in its den, powerful, cunning, and utterly ruthless on his own ground. Yet Eldridge Sample felt no fear, only a grim, steady resolve. His years in the Union Army, scouting enemy lines in the dense woods of the South, tracking guerrillas through swamps and mountains, had forged him into a relentless pursuer. He had learned to read the subtle tells of the wilderness, to move like a phantom through the densest undergrowth, to become one with the shadows. His skill with a rifle was not just marksmanship, it was an extension of his will, a cold, precise art that had saved his life countless times and ended the careers of men far more dangerous than common outlaws. He was a sniper by training and a hunter by nature, and Caleb Rook, for all his brute strength and local knowledge, was now the prey. The rising sun, a blood-red eye peering over the distant peaks, cast long, eerie shadows across the broken land. Sample adjusted the strap of his Winchester, his gaze fixed on the tracks that marked Rook's desperate flight. Each footprint was a confirmation, a step closer to the reckoning Rook had earned. He was a shadow, entering a darker shadow, a man of iron will plunging into a wilderness that mirrored the corruption he sought to excise. With a final, sweeping glance back at the silent, grieving town of Cypress Hollow, Eldridge Sample stepped off the cleared land and into the tangled embrace of the Ozark forest. The trees closed around him, their ancient branches filtering the nascent light, and the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through pine needles and the distant chatter of an unseen creek. He moved with an economy of motion, his boots finding purchase on the uneven ground, his eyes constantly scanning, interpreting the story written in bent twigs, disturbed stones, and the faint, persistent indentations in the earth that marked the devil's path. The hunt had begun. Chapter 8. The maw of the cavern that had swallowed Caleb Rook's trail was a jagged wound in the mountainside, half concealed by a dense thicket of rhododendrons and ancient gnarled oaks. Cool, damp air, carrying the scent of wet stone and sunless earth, exhaled from its depths. Eldridge Sample paused at the precipice, the filtered dawn light insufficient to penetrate the Stygian blackness that lay beyond. Rook's footprints, clear and deep in the soft loam at the cave entrance, led directly into this subterranean abyss. Rook, a creature of these brooding Ozarks, moved through the initial passages with the unerring confidence of a man traversing the hallways of his own home. The darkness was an ally, the rough-hewn rock a familiar caress to his scraped hands. He knew each turn, each sudden drop or treacherous seam in the stone, not by sight, but by a primal instinct, a memory etched into his very bones. This network of caverns was his secret kingdom, a labyrinth he had explored and exploited for years, its tendrils reaching deep beneath the mountains like the roots of some malevolent tree. He navigated by the feel of the passage walls, the subtle changes in airflow, the distant murmur of water that was a constant song in these deep places. One hand often brushed against the rock, a caress that was also a guide, while his other carried a smoldering pine knot torch, its resinous flame casting a fitful dancing light that threw his massive shadow into grotesque relief against the glittering mineral-streaked walls. The torch was used sparingly, more for specific junctions than constant illumination. He knew that light could be a beacon for any pursuer. Deeper he plunged, into chambers vast as cathedrals, where stalactites hung like icicles of stone, centuries in the making, and stalagmites rose from the floor like the teeth of some buried god. He passed through narrow squeezes that would have terrified a less desperate or less familiar man, his broad shoulders scraping against the unyielding rock. Underground rivers, their waters black and swift, sliced through some of these caverns, their roar a constant reminder of the power hidden beneath the earth. Rook crossed one such torrent on a series of slick, precarious stepping stones, a route known only to him, a path that would appear as a dead end to the uninitiated. In hidden alcoves, tucked away behind false walls of fallen rock or concealed within narrow crevices, were his caches. Here, over the years, he had secreted away supplies, tins of food, ammunition wrapped in oilskin, spare weapons, even caches of gold and currency extorted from the terrorized populace of Cypress Hollow and other more distant victims. He paused at one such cache now, a small, dry chamber high up in a chimney-like passage. Replenishing his torch, he also retrieved a heavy dragoon revolver, checking its load before thrusting it into his belt. He ate hastily, a piece of dried meat chewed with the ferocity of a hunted animal, his ears constantly attuned to any sound that might signal pursuit. Meanwhile, Eldridge Sample, having committed the cave entrance to memory, ventured into the oppressive darkness. He did not possess Rook's intimate, almost supernatural familiarity with these particular caverns, but he carried within him a wealth of experience garnered from the grim school of war. He had navigated trenches in the blackest of nights, scouted through enemy territory where a single misplaced footfall meant death, and tracked men through wildernesses just as unforgiving as this subterranean realm. He moved slowly, methodically. His initial light source was a tallow candle, shielded within a battered tin reflector, used only when absolutely necessary to examine the trail. Rook's heavy boots, often scraping mud or soft clay in the damper sections of the cave, left a more discernible trail than the sheriff likely realized. Sample noted the length of Rook's stride, the occasional drag of a foot that spoke of haste, perhaps even the beginnings of fatigue. The silence of the upper world was replaced here by a symphony of subterranean sounds, the constant rhythmic drip of water from unseen stalactites forming tiny pools that glittered like scattered diamonds in his fleeting light, the soft rustle of unseen creatures, bats perhaps, or cave crickets, the sigh of air currents moving through narrow fissures in the rock. These were the natural voices of the deep earth. But as Sample pressed further, other sounds began to intrude, subtle at first, then more distinct, more unsettling. A distant scraping noise, too rhythmic to be falling rock. A faint, metallic clink that could have been a misplaced canteen or a gun barrel striking stone. And then, more chillingly, what might have been a muffled cry, so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the gurgle of a hidden stream, yet carrying a timbre that was disturbingly human. Sample would pause often, extinguishing his candle, allowing his eyes to adjust to the absolute blackness, his ears straining to decipher these ambiguous messages from the depths. He moved with a predator's patience, testing each foothold, acutely aware of the potential for ambush in the labyrinthine passages. The air grew heavier, the scent of decay mingling with the clean smell of wet limestone. He marked his passage with tiny, almost invisible scratches on the walls at key junctions, a habit from his scouting days, ensuring he could, if necessary, find his way back through Rook's maze. He found evidence of Rook's passage: a discarded burnt-out torch, the greasy residue of a hurried meal, fresh mud scuffs high on a passage wall where the sheriff had squeezed through. Once, in a vast chamber where the ceiling soared into invisibility, he saw the faint, flickering glow of Rook's light far ahead, a mere firefly spark in the immense darkness, disappearing almost as soon as it was seen. The sheriff was moving fast, confident in his subterranean sanctuary. The caves seemed to twist and turn without end, a disorienting journey into the planet's underbelly. Some passages were wide and arched, their walls smooth and water-worn. Others were tight, claustrophobic fissures that forced Sample to turn sideways, his gear scraping against the rock. He felt the oppressive weight of millions of tons of stone above him, the chilling isolation of a world devoid of sun and sky. It was in one of these narrower passages, as he carefully negotiated a slick, downward-sloping floor, that he heard it again, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. It was not the wind, nor water, nor the scuttling of some cave denizen. It was a low moan, undeniably human, followed by a guttural laugh that echoed weirdly, distorted by the rock formations. The laugh was coarse, brutal, and carried a note of chilling familiarity. Rook. But the moan was not his. Sample froze, every sense alert. The sounds had come from a passage that branched off to his right, partially obscured by a curtain of rock. He extinguished his candle, plunging himself into a darkness so profound it felt like a physical weight. He listened, his breathing shallow and controlled. The sounds were not repeated, but their echo lingered, a cold promise of the horrors that might lie deeper within Rook's underground kingdom. This was more than just a criminal's bolt hole. The disturbing sounds hinted at a far more sinister purpose for these hidden chambers. With infinite caution, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, Sample moved toward the branching passage, the source of that chilling human sound. He was descending deeper into the devil's territory, and the unsettling echoes suggested that the devil was not alone. Chapter 9. He's coming down the old goat path. Looks like Caleb, by the size of him. The shout, raw, and carrying the twang of the hill country, echoed from a high rocky outcrop where a slovenly figure with a long rifle stood silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Below, nestled deep within a fold of the Ozark Mountains, so cunningly hidden that it seemed the earth itself conspired to conceal it, lay Devil's Den. It was no welcoming vale. Steep forest-choked slopes, scarred by ancient rock falls, and bristling with impenetrable thickets of briar and thorn, formed its ramparts. A sullen creek, the color of rust, snaked through its narrow floor, disappearing into a black fissure at the valley's western extreme. Crude cabins, built from rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud, squatted amidst the gloom like brooding animals, their small, unglazed windows resembling vacant eyes. Smoke, thin and acrid, curled from a few stone chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke, roasting game, and something else, a faint, unsettlingly rank odor that spoke of poor sanitation and lives lived too close to the bone. This was the ancestral den of the Rook Clan, a lineage steeped in violence and predation, who had clung to these harsh hills for generations, living by their own brutal code, a blight upon the remote frontier. They were a family of murderers, thieves, and worse, their evil as deeply rooted in the stony soil of Devil's Den as the twisted oaks that clawed at its slopes. Caleb Rook, his massive frame streaked with grime from his passage through the caverns, his clothes torn and his face a mask of grim exhaustion, emerged from a narrow cleft in the rock face at the den's entrance. He paused for a moment, breathing heavily, the familiar, wild scent of his family's domain filling his lungs. This was his sanctuary, the one place on earth where his authority was not merely derived from a tin badge, but was an extension of a more primal, inherited power. Figures began to emerge from the cabins, drawn by the lookout's cry. Men, mostly, lean and hard-bitten, their faces weathered, their eyes holding the watchful, suspicious gaze of cornered wolves. They were clad in homespun and buckskin, armed with a motley collection of rifles, shotguns, and heavy skinning knives thrust into their belts. A few women, gaunt and careworn, lingered in the doorways, their expressions unreadable. Two figures, taller and more imposing than the rest, moved to meet Caleb. The first, a man whose years had etched deep lines into his face but had not dimmed the fierce predatory light in his eyes, was Ezekiel Rook, Caleb's father. His beard, streaked with gray, cascaded down his chest, and a long, wicked-looking knife was sheathed at his hip. He carried himself with the unyielding authority of a patriarch who had ruled his savage brood through fear and cunning for decades. Beside him stood Mordecai Rook, Caleb's uncle, a man built on a similar scale to Caleb himself, his face a roadmap of old scars, his hands like gnarled roots. Mordecai was the clan's enforcer, his intellect secondary to his brute strength, and unwavering loyalty to his brother Ezekiel. Caleb, Ezekiel's voice was a low growl like stones grinding together. Thought we might be seeing you sooner or later, looking like the devil himself done chased you through a briar patch. There was no warmth in his tone, only a keen, assessing glint in his eyes. Father, Caleb acknowledged, nodding curtly to Mordecai. Been complications. Complications? Mordecai rumbled, his gaze sweeping over Caleb's disheveled state. Look more like you wrestled a bear and lost. Lost a round, maybe. Not the fight, Caleb retorted, his usual arrogance beginning to reassert itself now that he was back amongst his own kind. He stalked towards the largest cabin, the one that served as Ezekiel's domain, the rest of the clan parting before him, their murmurs a low, inquisitive hum. Inside the cabin was dimly lit by a flickering tallow lamp, and the glow from a stone hearth where a haunch of venison roasted, spitting fat into the flames. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Ezekiel settled onto a crude, high-backed chair that served as his throne, while Mordecai leaned against the rough log wall, arms crossed over his massive chest. Caleb slumped onto a bench, the weariness of his flight momentarily etching itself onto his features. "So," Ezekiel began, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. "This complication. It got a name?" "Sample," Caleb bit out. "Eldridge Sample. A U.S. Marshal. Harder than 10-cent whiskey and twice as mean." He recounted the events in Cypress Hollow. Sample's arrival with the prisoner Motley, the Marshal's unnerving perception, the failed attempt to use Motley to eliminate him, and his own narrow escape after silencing Deputy Hawkins. As he spoke, the faces of Ezekiel and Mordecai remained impassive, but a grim understanding settled in their eyes. "A federal man," Ezekiel mused, stroking his beard. "They're like hounds from hell, some of 'em. Once they get a scent." "He's got the scent, all right," Caleb admitted. "Followed me into the caverns. He's good. Army scout, I reckon. Knew how to read sign, even in the dark." Mordecai pushed himself off the wall. "One man. We got near 24 rifles in this den. Let him come. We'll give him a welcome he won't walk away from." "It ain't just about killing him, Mordecai, you damn fool," Ezekiel snapped, his voice sharp. "It's about what he knows, who he might have talked to. Caleb's badge," he gestured towards his son, "that was our shield for years. It kept the law away from our enterprises. It let us bleed Cypress Hollow and the other settlements dry without no real trouble. If this Sample starts digging too deep, if he brings more law dogs sniffing around." Caleb nodded grimly. He saw enough in town to get suspicious. The fear in folks' eyes, the way Murphy and Keller acted. And finding Hawkins, he'll know I had to silence him. He looked at his father. He's not the kind to give up. He'll track me here or die trying. For generations, the Rook Clan had thrived in these isolated mountains, their tendrils of fear and violence extending throughout the region. They took what they wanted, livestock, goods, money, and sometimes people, their brutality unchecked, their crimes masked by Caleb's position as sheriff. His badge had been the key, turning their remote sanctuary into an almost untouchable fiefdom. Now that protection was shattered, and the outside world, in the form of one relentless marshal, was about to come crashing down upon them. Ezekiel Rook was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the heavy breathing of the three Rook men. The weight of their long history of depredations, the fear of its unraveling, hung heavy in the smoky air. Finally, Ezekiel looked up, his eyes cold and resolute. "He knows the caverns lead this way?" "He was on my heels," Caleb confirmed. "Heard him, I think, just before I broke out into the upper creek bed." "Then he ain't far behind," Ezekiel stated, his voice dropping to a predatory calm. "This ain't no time for rashness, Mordecai. This Sample, if he's as good as Caleb says, won't walk blind into a simple ambush." He paused, a cruel smile touching his lips. "But Devil's Den has its own ways of welcoming strangers." He rose from his chair, his old bones creaking, but his presence filling the room with a renewed sense of menace. "Mordecai, you take 12 men. Scatter 'em along the ridge paths, the narrow defiles leading in. Caleb, you show him the likeliest routes he'll take from the cavern exit. Don't engage him direct, not at first. We need to know if he's alone, how much he's figured out. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. We'll let him get close. Let him think he's still the hunter. He walked towards the cabin door, his shadow looming large. Then we spring the trap. This Marshal Sample wants to see the devil's den. We'll make damn sure he gets a taste of its hell. He threw open the door and bellowed into the growing darkness, his voice rolling across the valley like a clap of thunder. Rooks. To me. We got a guest comin'. Chapter 10. The oppressive blackness of the caverns gradually yielded to a bruised pre-dawn twilight as Eldridge Sample emerged from a narrow fissure choked with ferns and moss-slick rocks. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, the cool, pine-scented air a welcome change from the stagnant, mineral-laden atmosphere of the underground passages. He was high on a rugged slope, overlooking a deep, shadowed valley that seemed to cup the last dregs of the night. Rook's trail, fresher now, marked by broken twigs and the distinct imprint of his heavy boots in a patch of damp earth, led downwards into the gloom. Sample moved with the wind, a ghost in the growing light, his Winchester held ready. Every instinct, honed by years of navigating hostile territory, screamed that he was approaching the heart of Rook's domain. The wild, untamed nature of the terrain was subtly changing. Faint game trails were more trodden, and once he caught the distant, unmistakable ring of an axe biting into wood, a sound that had no place in a truly empty wilderness. He crested a small rise, dense with cedar and tangled rhododendron, and paused, peering through the leafy screen. Below him, perhaps half a mile distant, lay a hidden pocket in the mountains, a narrow den carved by an ancient stream. Faint wisps of smoke curled from several points within the valley, and though he could not yet make out distinct structures, he knew with a cold certainty that this was it, Devil's Den. Rook had come home. The Marshal proceeded with infinite caution, avoiding the more obvious paths, choosing instead to stay high on the valley's flank, using the dense undergrowth and rock formations for cover. He was a hunter stalking a dangerous beast in its lair, and the lair itself was a formidable adversary. The silence of the valley floor seemed unnatural, a watchful stillness that prickled his skin. He scanned the tree lines, the shadowed overhangs, the dark mouths of smaller caves that pocked the limestone cliffs. He had tracked Rook to the very edge of his sanctuary. The tracks were now mingled with others, moccasin prints, the scuffs of worn-out work boots, confirming Caleb was not alone. Sample's jaw tightened. He was moving into a place where the odds would be stacked heavily against him. His plan had been to locate Rook, assess the situation, and then, if possible, find a way to bring the full weight of the law down on him. But the raw, untamed nature of this hidden valley suggested that the law, as civilized men knew it, had never taken root here. He was contemplating his next move, weighing the risks of a lone reconnaissance against the imperative to act before Rook could rally his full strength, when the world exploded around him. It was not a single shot, but a crashing volley of rifle fire erupting from the seemingly empty slopes around him. Lead hammered the rocks where he had stood moments before, whining viciously as it ricocheted, tearing through the leaves and branches that had been his cover. Sample threw himself flat, belly crawling behind a weathered sandstone outcrop, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He had walked straight into a meticulously prepared ambush. Rough voices, filled with savage triumph, echoed from multiple directions. "Got him pinned?" one yelled. "Don't kill him yet. Pa wants him breathing." Sample peered around the edge of his rock, his Winchester barking once, twice, silencing a wild-haired man who had exposed himself on a nearby ledge. But it was like swatting at a swarm of angry hornets. Figures seemed to materialize from the very earth, lean, hard-faced men, their eyes burning with a feral intensity, emerging from behind trees, from shallow depressions in the ground, from the mouths of unseen crevices. They moved with a disturbing familiarity through the rugged terrain, their movements swift and sure-footed. There were more than he could count, In the first chaotic moments, a wave of determined, armed men closing in. Nearly 24 killers, he estimated, their rifles all trained on his meager position. He was surrounded, outgunned, with no viable escape route. For a moment, the bitter taste of futility rose in his throat. He could fight, die hard, take a few more with him, but it would be a futile gesture. They weren't interested in a fair fight. They were a pack overwhelming their quarry. "Throw out your rifle, Marshal," a commanding voice boomed, deeper and older than the others. Sample caught a glimpse of him. Ezekiel Rook, his gray beard flowing, his eyes like chips of ice, directing the assault from a slightly elevated position. And the handgun. Slow and easy, unless you want to die right here, right now, full of holes. Sample weighed his options. Death was certain if he kept fighting. Capture offered a slim, almost invisible chance, a possibility of learning more, of finding an opportunity, however remote. They wanted him alive, for now. That was his only leverage. With a grimace, he slid the Winchester out from behind the rock, followed by his Colt. The click of dozens of hammers being cocked was unnervingly loud in the sudden silence that followed. "Stand up. Hands where we can see 'em." Sample rose slowly, his hands held high, his face an unreadable mask. His gaze swept over the ring of hard-bitten men who now encircled him, their faces a mixture of suspicion, hatred, and a coarse, triumphant curiosity. These were the dregs of the frontier, men who lived by the creed of violence, their loyalty to their clan absolute, their morality non-existent. Mordecai Rook, a brutal giant of a man, shouldered his way through the others, a length of thick rope in his hand. He approached Sample with a predatory grin, his eyes glinting. "Well, well, Marshal. Come all this way just to visit us." His breath, rank and hot, washed over Sample as he roughly seized his arms. "Didn't figure you Rooks for the welcoming committee type," Sample said, his voice even, betraying none of the turmoil within. Mordecai laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, we got a special welcome for nosy lawdogs." He expertly bound Sample's hands behind his back, the ropes cutting cruelly into his wrists. Other clan members rushed forward, relieving him of his knife, his spare ammunition, anything that might serve as a weapon. "Why keep him alive, Pa?" one of the younger Rooks asked, his eyes still shining with the thrill of the capture. "Easier to just put a bullet in him now." Ezekiel approached, his gaze cold and appraising as he circled Sample. "This one ain't just some stray bounty hunter, Jed. He's a federal marshal. We need to know how much he's learned about our operations. Who else might be looking for Caleb, or for us? A dead man tells no tales, but a live one can be persuaded to talk." His lips curled into a sinister smile. "He'll tell us what we want to know before we're through with him." The old patriarch gestured towards the deeper recesses of the den. "Drag him to the citadel. We'll have a proper conversation there." The citadel, as Ezekiel called it, appeared to be a larger cave system at the far end of the valley, its entrance a dark, yawning maw in the cliff face, shadowed and imposing. It looked like an ancient Cherokee stronghold, now fortified with crude log barricades and reinforced rockfalls. This was clearly the heart of their operation, their defensible den. Rough hands shoved Sample forward, prodding him with rifle barrels when he didn't move fast enough. He stumbled over the uneven ground, his mind racing, cataloging every detail, every face, every pathway. He was a prisoner, disarmed and outnumbered, but he was not yet defeated. The Rooks wanted information. That meant he had time, however brief, however brutal it might prove to be. As they dragged him towards the dark entrance of their fortified cave, towards the unknown horrors that awaited within, Eldridge Sample began to plan. The hunter had become the hunted, but the fight, he knew, was far from over. Chapter 11. Drag the high and mighty lawman in here. Let him get a good, long look at the Rook hospitality before he meets his maker. Mordecai Rook's harsh laughter bounced off the damp stone walls as Sample was violently shoved through a narrow barricaded opening into the main chamber of the citadel. The air inside was a fetid cocktail of stale wood smoke, unwashed bodies rotting food, and an underlying miasma of fear and decay that caught in Sample's throat. Flickering torches and a large, smoky fire pit in the center of the vast cavern cast dancing, distorted shadows, revealing the true scope of the Rook clan's malevolent existence. This was no mere hideout. It was a primitive, subterranean village, a testament to generations of lawlessness. The immense natural cavern had indeed been an ancient Cherokee council site or fortress, its walls bearing faint, almost obliterated pictographs of hunts and battles from a bygone era. But the Rooks had desecrated it, turning it into a den of iniquity. Rough-hewn tables and benches were scattered about, stained with grease and what looked ominously like old blood. Piles of furs, some fresh, others decaying, lay in heaps. Crudely constructed lean-tos and partition sections lined the cavern walls, serving as sleeping quarters and storage areas. What struck Sample with a cold, sickening dread was the evidence of their far-reaching criminality. In one shadowed alcove, he saw a heap of plundered goods, saddles, bolts of cloth, crates bearing the names of merchants from towns 50 miles distant, even a child's forlorn rocking horse, its paint chipped and faded. This was the hoard of a band of brigands who preyed on any traveler unfortunate enough to cross their path. Further in, a low, guttural sobbing drew his attention. Through a narrow opening between two rock falls, he glimpsed a smaller, darker cavern. For a horrifying moment he saw them. 3 women, their faces pale and tear-streaked, their clothing torn, huddled together like frightened quail. They were captives, their eyes wide with terror, bearing the bruises and haunted expressions of those who had suffered unspeakable abuse. The Rooks were not just thieves and murderers, they were slavers, their depravity knowing no bounds. Ezekiel Rook, his face illuminated by the hellish glow of the fire pit, watched Sample's reactions with a glint of perverse satisfaction. He sat upon a makeshift throne of stacked pelts and carved stones, a veritable king in his squalid underground domain. Caleb stood near him, his earlier weariness replaced by a sullen, watchful arrogance. "Impressive, ain't it, Marshal?" Ezekiel sneered, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "What we built here? Generations of Rooks. We answer to no man, no law but our own." He gestured expansively with a gnarled hand. "We take what we need. What we want. The world out there, your world, it's weak, full of soft fools begging to be fleeced." Sample's gaze, cold and steady, met the old man's. He said nothing, his silence a more potent defiance than any outburst. He was cataloging every detail, the layout of the cavern, the number of armed men, at least 15 visible in this main chamber with others likely in the adjoining passages, the potential exits, the routines of this debased society. His eyes fell upon a dark, refuse-strewn corner near the back of the cavern. Amongst the debris, something caught the firelight, a glint of tarnished metal. With a sickening certainty, Sample recognized the corroded shape of a peace officer's badge, half buried in the filth. And another, older, of a different county. Nearby, a tattered piece of blue woolen fabric, unmistakably part of a uniform, lay trodden into the dirt. Then, further back in the shadows, he saw them, a scattered pile of human bones, gnawed by animals, some still bearing the marks of crude, violent ends. These were the remains of those who had come before him, lawmen and others who had dared to challenge the Rook dynasty, their fates a grim testament to the clan's ruthlessness. "See you Admiral R. Historical Society," Ezekiel chuckled, noticing Sample's grim focus. "Yes, Marshal. You ain't the first man with a badge to come pocking his nose into Rook business. Just the latest. And soon to be the most permanent resident." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a fanatic's zeal. "We had a good thing here, Marshal. A real good thing. Caleb, he kept the outside world off our backs. Protection, see? He taxed Cypress Hollow, just enough to keep him scared and cooperative. And anything bigger, any real trouble, well, the mountains took care of it. Or we did. Your son's a murderer and a coward, Sample stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He killed his own deputy in cold blood. Caleb bristled, taking a step forward, but Ezekiel waved him back. Hawkins was a means to an end, Marshal. Like Motley. Like you. The old man's smile widened, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth. And now, you're a loose end. A dangerous one. You've seen too much. Ezekiel rose, pacing slowly before Sample, his movements like those of a caged wolf. We could have just killed you in the den. Quick. Easy. But that ain't no fun, is it? And besides, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a man like you, a federal man, your disappearance needs to be memorable. A lesson to others who might think of following your trail. He stopped, his face inches from Sample's. We got plans for you, Marshal. Oh yes. Special plans. He began to describe, in chilling, unhurried detail, the protracted torment they intended for him. He spoke of exposure to the elements in the high, desolate passes, of slow starvation, of the ingenious cruelties his clan had perfected over generations of torturing their enemies. He painted a vivid picture of a lingering, agonizing demise, designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. His eyes gleamed with sadistic delight as he elaborated on each gruesome stage. The other clan members listened with rapt attention, some chuckling, others licking their lips in anticipation. Their faces, in the wavering firelight, were masks of primitive cruelty. Sample listened, his expression unchanging, but beneath his stoic exterior his mind worked with cold precision. He filed away every threat, every detail of Ezekiel's horrific monologue, not with fear, but with a deepening resolve. These were not just outlaws, they were a cancer on the land, a pocket of primal savagery that had festered too long in the dark places of the frontier. You think fear will make me talk? Sample finally said, his voice a low rasp. Tell you what you want to know. Ezekiel laughed, a harsh cackling sound. Oh, you'll talk, Marshal. Before the end, all men talk. They beg. They weep. It's just a matter of time. And pain. He savored the words. We Rooks, we got plenty of both to spare. He turned to Mordecai. Take him to the deep cell. The one with the special view. Let him contemplate his future. Let him listen to the mountain's heart. He'll have plenty of time to get acquainted with the darkness. Mordecai grinned, seizing Sample's arm in a brutal grip. Come on, lawman. Your new lodgings await. He and another burly Rook clansman began to drag Sample away from the firelight, deeper into the labyrinthine cave system, towards an even more remote and lightless section of their vile stronghold. Chapter 12. The deep cell was a narrow, coffin-shaped fissure in the rock, branching off a lesser-used passage far from the main fire-lit cavern of the citadel. Mordecai had shoved Sample into the pitch-black space with a final, brutal curse, and a heavy, crudely fashioned timber door, reinforced with strips of hammered iron, had thudded shut, its thick bar dropping into place with an echoing finality. The air was frigid, rank with the smell of bat guano and ancient undisturbed dust. Total darkness pressed in, a tangible entity that seemed to suck the very warmth from his body. Sample lay still for a long while, letting the throbbing in his wrists subside, his senses straining against the oppressive blackness. Ezekiel's gloating threats, the images of the enslaved women, the desecrated bones of past lawmen, all burned in his mind, fueling not despair, but a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He had been in worse places. The Confederate prison camp outside Cahaba had been a true hell on earth, a place of starvation, disease, and casual brutality. It was there, amidst the constant presence of death, that he had learned the vital calculus of survival: patience, observation, and the unwavering will to exploit any weakness, however small. His hands were bound tight behind him with rawhide, the knots expertly tied by Mordecai. But rawhide, when persistently worked, had a tendency to stretch, especially if one could introduce any moisture or abrasion. He began to test the bonds minutely, almost imperceptibly, flexing his wrists, rotating his shoulders, feeling for any give. His fingers, roughened by years of handling reins and iron, explored the texture of the knots. Hours passed in the suffocating darkness, marked only by the distant, distorted sounds of the Rook Clan's activities: a raucous laugh, a shouted command, the mournful howl of one of their dogs. Sample worked. He pressed his bound wrists against the rough, uneven surface of the cave wall, a slow, grinding abrasion. He remembered a trick an old trapper had shown him, a way of using his own body as leverage to create slack. It was agonizingly slow, the rawhide biting into his flesh, his muscles screaming in protest. Sweat, cold in the frigid air, beaded on his forehead. He thought of the prisoners at Cahaba, the ones who had given up, their eyes growing hollow before their bodies failed. He would not be one of them. Slowly, painstakingly, a fraction of an inch at a time, he felt the rawhide give. One loop loosened, then another. His fingers, numb and aching, fumbled with the complex knots. It was like trying to pick a lock with frozen twigs, but the memory of past escapes, of desperate gambits played out in similar darkness, guided his efforts. Finally, with a surge of grim satisfaction, his right hand pulled free. Then the left. He chafed his wrists, restoring circulation, his mind already racing ahead. He had no weapon, no light. The door was solid, the bar on the outside. He listened intently at the timber, pressing his ear to the wood. He could hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of a guard stationed not far from the cell door, punctuated by an occasional snuffle or a muttered curse as the man shifted position. Sometimes he heard two voices, low and indistinct. Time was his enemy now. Dawn could not be far off, and with it would come discovery. He needed a weapon, a distraction, an opportunity. His eyes, now somewhat accustomed to the Stygian gloom, could make out faint variations in the blackness, the slightly less dense darkness of the passage beyond the door's ill-fitting edges. He searched his tiny prison, his hands sweeping the floor and walls. His fingers brushed against a loose flake of rock, roughly triangular, its edge surprisingly sharp. It wasn't much, but it was something. He waited, every nerve taut, until he heard the telltale signs of a guard change, or at least one guard moving off, leaving only one. The breathing pattern outside became singular. Now, clutching the sharp stone, Sample moved to the door. He began to make a soft, rhythmic scraping sound near the base of the timber, mimicking the sound of a rat gnawing wood, a common enough sound in these caves. He kept it up for long minutes, patient, hoping to draw the guard's curiosity or irritation. A gruff voice sounded outside. "What in the damnation is that?" Footsteps approached. The bar on the door lifted, with a grating squeal. The door creaked open a few inches, a sliver of murky torchlight from the main passage piercing the blackness. A silhouetted head and shoulders peered in. "Quiet in there, damn you." Sample exploded from the darkness like a striking panther. He slammed his full weight against the door, driving it outward, knocking the guard off balance. The man yelped in surprise, stumbling back, his torch clattering to the stone floor, its flame sputtering. Before the guard could recover or raise an alarm, Sample was on him. He brought the sharp edge of the stone down in a vicious, targeted strike against the man's temple. The guard grunted, his body going limp, and collapsed without another sound. Sample didn't pause. He knew another guard was often stationed at the junction leading to this remote section. He scooped up the fallen torch, its flame now burning brighter, and scanned the immediate area. The dead guard had a pistol tucked into his belt and a knife. Sample claimed them both, along with a sparse ammunition pouch. Moving with the silence of a wraith, he crept down the passage towards the junction. As he neared, he saw the second guard, a lanky youth, leaning against the cave wall, half asleep, his rifle propped beside him. This one was easier. Sample approached from the man's blind side, the torch held low to minimize his shadow. The guard never knew what hit him. Sample used the butt of the newly acquired pistol in a swift, practiced blow to the base of the skull. The youth crumpled silently. 2 down. He quickly gathered the second rifle, more ammunition, and a small water skin the young guard carried. He found a small sack containing dried meat and hard biscuits, meager rations but precious. He now had a choice of weapons, basic supplies, and a desperate chance. He knew he couldn't go back through the main cavern. It would be stirring with activity as dawn approached. He needed another way out, a path less traveled. His brief, brutal journey to the cell had given him a fragmented map of the adjoining passages. He remembered one that seemed to lead upwards, away from the clan's central den. He moved swiftly but cautiously, the torch casting flickering shadows that danced like malevolent spirits on the cave walls. He passed openings to other dark chambers, hearing the snores and muttered sleep talk of Rook clansmen, blissfully unaware of the viper that had just escaped in their midst. The upward passage was steep and narrow, little more than a chimney in places. He had to douse the torch and climb by feel, his shoulder scraping against the rock. It was during this ascent, as he squeezed through a particularly tight section, that a jagged outcrop of stone tore a deep gash in his left forearm. He hissed in pain, but didn't stop, knowing that the first light of dawn would bring discovery and a furious pursuit. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of scrambling in the dark, he felt a draft of cool, fresh air that smelled of pine and damp earth, not the fetid breath of the caves. He saw a faint luminescence ahead. With a final burst of effort, he pulled himself up and out through a narrow crack, almost invisible from the outside, onto a wild, windswept ridge. He was free. But as he stood there, the first pale streaks of dawn painting the eastern sky, he knew his ordeal was far from over. He was wounded, his arm bleeding freely, sending a throbbing ache up to his shoulder. He was alone, deep in hostile territory, with a small arsenal but limited supplies. And the Rook clan, when they discovered his escape and the deaths of their guards, would be on his trail like a pack of enraged wolves. They knew every stone, every tree, every secret path in these mountains. He took a moment to bind his bleeding arm tightly with a strip of cloth torn from his tattered shirt, then scanned the rugged landscape, already committing it to memory. The hunt would now be reversed. He was no longer the pursuer, but the pursued. The taste of freedom was bittersweet, mixed with the metallic tang of his own blood, and the cold certainty of the desperate fight for survival that lay ahead. With a last glance at the hidden exit of his escape route, Eldridge Sample turned his face to the wilderness and began to move, melting into the shadows of the waking forest just as the sun crested the peaks. Chapter 13. The discovery of Sample's escape and the 2 slain guards threw the Rook citadel into a paroxysm of fury. Ezekiel Rook's roar of incandescent rage echoed through the caverns, a sound more animal than human, startling bats from their roosts and sending a fresh wave of terror through the captive women. Caleb, his face a thundercloud of frustrated malice, kicked savagely at the lifeless body of the guard Sample had felled with the stone, cursing his carelessness. He's gone. The marshal's gone, and 2 of our own lie dead. Mordecai bellowed, his voice thick with outrage, as he burst into the main cavern where Ezekiel was already barking orders. That devil in a badge slipped right through our fingers. He didn't just slip, you oaf. Ezekiel spat, his eyes blazing. He killed them. Silently. This ain't no ordinary lawman we're dealing with. This is a wolf amongst sheep, and we've let him taste blood. His gaze swept over his assembled clan. A score of hardened, heavily armed men now gathered, their faces grim and hungry for vengeance. He's wounded, but he's armed. He'll be making for the deep wilderness. Spread out. Every man who can track, every man who can shoot. I want him found. I want him brought back here, alive if possible, so I can peel the skin from his bones myself. But if it comes to it, put him down like the rabid dog he is. Within minutes, the entire Rook clan mobilized for the hunt. Their knowledge of the surrounding Ozark wilderness was as intimate as the lines on their own calloused hands. They fanned out from Devil's Den, their movements practiced and efficient, a deadly net cast wide. Lean, half-starved hounds, their ribs showing, were unleashed, their mournful bays soon echoing through the ridges and hollows as they sought the marshal's scent. These were not well-trained tracking dogs, but vicious mongrels, used to running down game and cornering any creature unfortunate enough to be their quarry. Some of the older Rook clansmen, men who had learned their woodcraft from fathers and grandfathers, who in turn might have gleaned it from the remnants of Cherokee lore or the harsh necessities of mountain survival, moved with a stealth and perception that rivaled Sample's own. They scanned the forest floor for the slightest sign, a freshly turned stone, a bruised leaf, a broken cobweb across a game trail. They understood the flow of water, the direction of the wind, the habits of wild creatures, all of which could betray the passage of a man trying to hide. Eldridge Sample, miles away by now, was a phantom moving through a hostile world. The gash on his forearm throbbed relentlessly, a burning reminder of his narrow escape. He had paused only briefly after sunrise, finding a secluded spot by a rushing stream where the cold, clear water numbed the pain. He washed the wound as best he could, grimacing as he picked out fragments of rock and dirt. He remembered his army days, the field medics using sphagnum moss for its absorbent and mildly antiseptic qualities. He found a patch growing near the water's edge, packing it against the bleeding gash before binding it tightly once more with the strip of his shirt. It was a crude dressing, but it would have to do. His every skill, learned in the brutal crucible of war and honed over years of tracking wanted men, was now dedicated to pure survival. He moved without leaving a discernible sign, choosing paths over rock and through running water to break his trail and confound the dogs whose baying he could now hear, a distant but persistent threat. He climbed steep inclines, waded through icy streams, and pushed his way through dense laurel thickets that tore at his remaining clothes and flesh. He knew the Rooks would be relentless. This was their territory, their hunting ground. He was the outsider, the wounded stag pursued by a pack of wolves who knew every inch of the forest. He had to think like them, anticipate their moves, and then do the unexpected. Water was plentiful in the mountain streams, but shelter was a more pressing concern. He needed a place to rest, however briefly, a place where he could watch his back trail and avoid stumbling into another ambush. He found it late in the afternoon, a shallow overhang on a remote north-facing slope, screened by a dense growth of young pines. From here, he had a commanding view of the valley below, and the wind, coming from the south, would carry any scent of him away from the main paths of pursuit. He ate sparingly of the dried meat and hard biscuit, forcing himself to conserve his meager supplies. The pain in his arm was a constant companion, and a feverish heat was beginning to creep through his body. He needed more than moss for his wound. He scanned the undergrowth, his eyes searching for the broad leaves of plantain or the feathery tops of yarrow, plants he knew possessed healing properties. He found plantain growing in a damp patch near a spring, crushing the leaves to make a crude poultice, which he applied to his wound, the cool greenness a small measure of relief. As dusk began to settle, painting the Ozark ridges in hues of purple and blood orange, the baying of the dogs grew closer, then veered off, a sign that his evasive tactics were working, at least for now. He saw distant figures, Rook clansmen, moving along a ridge opposite his hiding place, their forms small and ant-like against the vast backdrop of the mountains. They were searching, methodically, but also with a growing agitation. The Rooks were indeed becoming frustrated. They had expected to run him to ground quickly. Their dogs, usually so effective, were confused by Sample's scentless trails through water and over stone. The subtle signs their best trackers looked for seemed to vanish, as if the marshal were a spirit, a ghost in the trees. Caleb, driven by a burning need to redeem himself in his father's eyes and exact revenge, pushed his kinsman hard, his temper fraying with each passing hour that brought no sign of their quarry. He can't have just vanished. Caleb snarled at Mordecai as they conferred at a creek crossing, the dogs whining and milling uncertainly. He's one man wounded. How can one man disappear like smoke in these hills? Mordecai, his face grim, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the water. This ain't no ordinary man, Caleb. Ezekiel was right. He's like a damned cougar. Knows how to hide his tracks, how to use the land. Ezekiel, when the reports reached him, merely nodded, his ancient eyes glinting with a mixture of cold anger and a grudging respect for his unseen adversary. He's playing with us, the old patriarch rasped, trying to wear us down. But these mountains have patience. And so do we. He has to eat, he has to sleep. He'll make a mistake. And when he does... Sample, hidden in his rocky crevice, watched the last of the daylight fade. He was exhausted, his body aching, his wound a throbbing fire. But within him, a cold, hard core of determination remained. He had survived the first day. He had eluded their initial sweep. The hunters were frustrated, their arrogance taking a blow. He knew this was only the beginning of the ordeal. The night would offer a brief respite, a chance to move under the cover of darkness, to further distance himself, to perhaps even begin to turn the tables. As the stars emerged, cold and distant in the black Arkansas sky, Eldridge Sample, the hunted, began to think like a hunter once more. The Rooks thought they were chasing a wounded animal. They would soon learn they were dealing with something far more dangerous. Chapter 14. Seen anything, Jeb? The voice, raspy with fatigue and laced with an undercurrent of unease, drifted through the gray morning mist clinging to the steep Ozark hillside. My eyes are about to fall out of my head from looking for sign of that damn marshal. It's like he just flew off. Jebediah Rook, a lanky, sallow-faced man with a perpetually worried expression, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto a patch of moss. Nothing since yesterday morning, Eli. Not a damn track the dogs could hold, not a whisper. 3 days we've been beating these hills. Man's either a ghost, or the devil himself done spirited him away. He shivered, though the morning air was not particularly cold. Gives me the creeps, wandering these woods knowing he's out here, somewhere. Eli, a heavier, surly man, grunted. Ghost or no, Pa wants his hide. And Caleb's fit to be tied. If we don't find him soon. He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. High above them, nestled in a nearly inaccessible crevice amongst a jumble of lichen-covered boulders and stunted pines, Eldridge Sample heard their voices, faint and distorted by the distance and the clinging mist. He lay prone, the stolen Winchester rifle resting on a flat rock before him, its barrel cool against his cheek. His wounded arm throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but his eyes were clear, his hands steady. For 2 days and nights, he had moved like a whisper through the rugged terrain, his meager supplies dwindling, his body pushed to the limits of endurance. He had watched the Rook Clan's frustrated efforts, their increasingly disorganized sweeps, the growing fear in their movements. Now the time for mere evasion was over. It was time to remind them that the hunted could also become the hunter. His Union Army sniper training, learned in the bloody thickets of the wilderness and the long, grim sieges of Petersburg, came back to him now with a chilling clarity. He had been taught to be a patient, unseen force, a dealer of death from afar. He had learned to read the wind, to calculate distance over broken ground, to make one shot count with lethal precision. The rifle he'd taken from the Rook Guard was a standard Henry repeater, not the specialized sharps he'd favored in the war, but it was a solid, accurate weapon in capable hands. He had spent the last hour of darkness meticulously cleaning the rifle, ensuring its action was smooth, its barrel true. He selected his first target with cold detachment, Eli, the heavier of the two men whose conversation he'd just overheard. Eli stood partially exposed on a projecting spur of rock, scanning the valley below, a perfect silhouette against the slowly brightening eastern sky. The distance was extreme, well over 400 yards, a shot most men wouldn't even attempt with open sights in this terrain. Sample controlled his breathing, letting it out slowly, feeling the familiar stillness settle over him. He lined up the sights, allowing for the slight breeze that eddied up the mountainside, leading his target by a hair's breadth. His finger tightened on the trigger, a smooth, steady pressure. The crack of the Henry was sharp and clean in the morning air, less a roar than a whip snap. Jebediah Rook, still complaining about their fruitless search, saw Eli suddenly arch backward as if struck by an invisible fist, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Eli's rifle clattered from his grasp, and he toppled from the rock spur, disappearing into the mist-shrouded trees below with a sickening thud. Jebediah froze, his jaw dropping, his eyes wide with stunned terror. "Eli!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. He scrambled for cover behind a thick oak, his head whipping around, trying to pinpoint the source of the shot. But there was nothing, only the silent, mist-wreathed trees and the echoing report of the rifle fading into the vastness of the mountains. Sample didn't wait to see the result of his shot. He was already moving, melting back from his firing position, disappearing into the labyrinth of boulders and dense undergrowth like smoke. He knew the clan would react violently, converging on the area, searching for the unseen shooter. His aim was not just to kill, but to sow terror and confusion, to turn their confidence into a quivering dread. An hour later, further along the ridge, another Rook clansman, a young hothead named Finn, who had been loudly boasting of what he'd do to the marshal when they caught him, was careless. He stepped into a sun-dappled clearing to get a better view of the surrounding terrain. Again, the unseen rifle spoke from an impossible distance. Finn spun around, clutching his throat where the bullet had struck, a look of utter disbelief on his face before he collapsed in a heap. His companions, hearing the shot, dove for cover, their faces pale, firing blindly into the trees. Panic began to take root amongst the Rook clan. This was no ordinary shootout. There was no muzzle flash to aim at, no enemy to charge. Just sudden, inexplicable death delivered from an unseen hand. The shots seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The marksman a phantom who struck with terrifying accuracy and then vanished without a trace. "It ain't natural," one clansman whispered, his eyes rolling with fear as they huddled behind a rockfall after Finn's death. "No man can shoot like that, not without you seeing him. It's a haint, I tell you. A forest demon sent to plague us." Caleb Rook, his face livid with rage and a dawning, chilling apprehension, tried to rally his men. "Spread out. Find him. He can't be invisible." But his orders lacked their usual conviction. He too felt the icy touch of an unknown fear. He had seen good marksmen before, but this was something else, something that felt unnatural. Throughout the day, Sample continued his deadly work. He chose his targets carefully, the overconfident, the stragglers, those who presented a clear shot. Each victim fell without ever seeing their killer, often without even hearing the shot before it struck. He moved constantly, using his knowledge of terrain and his army-taught fieldcraft to stay one step ahead of their increasingly frantic searches. He would fire from one concealed position, then spend an hour or more carefully making his way to another, miles distant, leaving no trail a rook could follow. The hunters, once so sure of their prowess in these familiar mountains, were now jumpy, their nerves frayed. They started seeing shadows in every thicket, imagining a rifle barrel in every dark crevice. The baying of their own dogs began to sound like a death knell. They bunched together for safety, making themselves easier targets, or scattered in panic, making them vulnerable. By late afternoon, 3 more Rook clansmen lay dead in the silent Ozark wilderness, each killed by a single perfectly placed bullet. The clan's initial fury had morphed into a superstitious terror. They were no longer hunting a mere man. They were being stalked by something they couldn't understand, a ghost in the trees, an invisible harbinger of death. Ezekiel Rook, when word of the mounting casualties reached him back at the citadel, felt a cold dread seep into his ancient bones. This marshal was more than just skilled. He was turning their own wilderness against them, transforming their sanctuary into a killing ground. As twilight began to creep through the forest, casting long, menacing shadows, Sample found himself overlooking a narrow game trail he knew a group of rooks would likely use to return to their camp. He settled into a new sniper's nest, a natural hollow in a rock face screened by heavy brush. He checked his dwindling supply of cartridges. He had made his point today. The rooks were bleeding, and they were afraid. The balance of power was shifting. He watched as a group of 4 clansmen, their movements hesitant, their rifles held at the ready, their eyes constantly scanning the darkening woods, approached down the trail. They looked less like hunters now, and more like frightened sheep huddling together against a storm. Sample smiled grimly, the expression devoid of warmth. The storm was just beginning. He raised the Henry, sighting on the lead figure. Chapter 15. He got Lem. God Almighty, he shot Lem. The shriek tore through the twilight dimness of the game trail, raw with disbelief and nascent hysteria. The remaining 3 Rook clansmen dove for the scant cover offered by the forest floor, their hearts hammering like trapped birds. From where? I didn't see nothing. Nothing at all. The rifle crack, when it came, had been another disembodied sound, a venomous spit from the deepening shadows, and Lemuel Rook, who had been walking point, had simply crumpled, a hole appearing as if by magic high on his chest. He lay still, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise, the last rays of sunlight catching the dull gleam of his dropped rifle. Eldridge Sample, already melting back from his sniper's perch, allowed himself a grim, fleeting thought. 6 of Rook's murderous brood were now accounted for. But his purpose was evolving beyond mere attrition. He had seen the superstitious fear beginning to take root in them, the cracks appearing in their savage unity. Now he would pry those cracks wide open. His war against the Rooks was entering a new, more insidious phase. The next morning, a Rook search party, moving with extreme caution, found Lemuel's body. It was not where it had fallen. Sample, under the cover of darkness, had dragged it to a small clearing and propped it against a massive, lightning-blasted oak. Lemuel's lifeless hands had been folded in his lap, as if in prayer, and his unseeing eyes stared directly down the path leading back towards Devil's Den. Tucked into his hands was a single, wilted black-eyed Susan, a flower that grew in abundance near the desecrated graves Sample had glimpsed in the citadel. There was no note, no overt threat, just the silent, disturbing tableau that screamed of judgment. When the men brought word of this back to the main encampment, a palpable chill went through the clan. "That ain't natural," muttered Silas, one of the older, more superstitious Rooks, his face pale. "Arrangin' a dead man like that, it's witchery. He's puttin' a curse on us." Caleb Rook, his face dark with fury and a growing, gnawing anxiety, struck Silas across the face. "Curse? You old fool. It's a man. Just a man. He's trying to spook us." But even as he bellowed, he felt the icy tendrils of doubt. The Marshal's tactics were unnervingly effective, striking not just at their numbers but at their minds. The psychological assaults escalated. That night, while the clan huddled around their fires, their sentries doubled. Sample, moving with the silence of a drifting shadow, raided the periphery of their camp. He didn't take much: a side of bacon from their dwindling stores, a sack of coffee, a few boxes of rifle cartridges. But the theft itself was a profound violation. It demonstrated his ability to penetrate their defenses at will, to move amongst them unseen. The realization that he could have slit their throats as they slept left them sweating and wide-eyed. "He was here," young Tom Rook whispered, his voice trembling as he pointed to the empty space where the supplies had been. "Walked right past us." "Maybe it weren't him," another clansman, Jed, suggested, his eyes darting nervously towards his fellows. "Maybe one of us got light fingers, or been helping him." The accusation hung heavy in the smoky air. Suspicion, like a poisonous vine, began to writhe through the camp. Men who had ridden together, plundered together, and killed together for years now eyed each other with distrust. Old grudges, simmering resentments began to surface. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, fueled by fear and frayed nerves. Then came the carved warnings. On a prominent beech tree near where Finn had fallen, Sample used his knife to carve a single stark word: deceiver. Near another ambush site, the word was thief. And on a trail leading towards a hidden water source the clan favored, he left a more elaborate carving, a crude depiction of a pair of scales, one side weighed down, the other empty, above the date of Deputy Hawkins's murder. These cryptic messages, coupled with the unnerving arrangement of the bodies and the stealthy thefts, preyed on their guilt and superstitions. They were uneducated men, many of them, their understanding of the world shaped by folklore and a harsh, unforgiving God. Sample's actions seemed to tap into their deepest fears of retribution, of a supernatural vengeance for their countless sins. "He knows," whispered Marybeth Rook, one of the older women who had seen the carving of the scales. "He knows about the deputy. He knows about everything." Her fear was infectious, spreading amongst the other women, who in turn fanned the flames of terror among the men. Caleb Rook's authority, once absolute within the clan, built on a foundation of brute strength, and his father's fearsome reputation, began to visibly crumble. His orders were met with sullen reluctance or outright questioning. When he tried to organize a more disciplined pursuit, his kinsmen balked, their terror of the unseen sniper outweighing their fear of his wrath. "You lead the way, Caleb," sneered Bart, a grizzled Rook cousin who had always chafed under Caleb's command. "You're the one brought this devil down on us with your fancy sheriffin'. You go out there and face him, if you got the guts." Caleb, his face contorted with rage, lunged at Bart, and the two men wrestled in the dirt, their kinsmen watching with a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. Mordecai had to pull them apart, but the damage was done. The image of Caleb, the fearsome enforcer, brawling like a common thug, his authority openly challenged, was a potent symbol of their unraveling. Ezekiel Rook watched it all, with a deepening despair. His clan, his fist, was shattering from within. The Marshal was not just killing them, he was disemboweling their very spirit. The old man retreated further into himself, his pronouncements becoming rarer, his eyes holding the vacant look of a man staring into an abyss. Sample, from his hidden vantage points, observed the growing chaos. He saw the arguments, the neglect of sentry duty, as fear made men huddle together, the way they started at every unexplained sound in the forest. He had turned their greatest strength, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, and their brutal cohesiveness, into a weakness. They were now trapped in their own sanctuary, terrorized by an enemy they could not see, an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move, an enemy who knew their sins. One evening, as a cold rain began to fall, adding to the misery of the Rook Clan, they found another of their missing men, Amos, not dead from a bullet, but hanging by his own belt from the limb of an oak tree overlooking Devil's Den. There were no marks of violence on him, save the rope burns on his neck. In his hand, clutched tight, was a crudely fashioned child's doll, made of twigs and scraps of cloth, a haunting echo of the rocking horse Sample had seen in their plunder. Had Amos, his mind broken by fear and guilt, taken his own life? Or had the Marshal, in an act of supreme psychological audacity, orchestrated this as well, leaving it ambiguous, another seed of terror? The remaining Rooks stared at the scene in horrified silence, the rain plastering their hair to their faces. This was no longer a hunt. It was a nightmare. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey, picked off, toyed with, driven to madness by a relentless, invisible force. Caleb Rook looked at the hanging body of his kinsman, then at the pale, terrified faces of the men around him. His own authority was a meaningless charade. He felt a desperate urge to flee, to escape not just the Marshal, but the suffocating weight of his family's fear and his own failure. He opened his mouth to shout an order, any order, to try and reassert control, but the words died in his throat as a blood-curdling scream echoed from the direction of the citadel, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that spoke of some new, unspeakable horror discovered within their very stronghold. Chapter 16. What in tarnation was that caterwauling? Mordecai Rook bellowed, his voice tight with alarm, grabbing his rifle as the blood-curdling scream from the direction of the citadel ripped through the rain-soaked forest. "Another one of your phantoms, Marshal," he snarled, though his eyes darted nervously towards the dark, brooding entrance to their stronghold. Caleb Rook, his face already a mask of haggard fear and frustration, didn't answer. He, along with the other remaining clansmen, stood frozen, the sound of that raw terror, a man's shriek of ultimate mind-shattering horror, raising the hackles on their necks. It was followed by a babble of panicked shouts from within the cave, then a chilling silence that was almost worse. Whatever new torment the unseen Marshal had unleashed, it had struck at the very heart of their sanctuary. While the Rooks recoiled from this fresh wave of psychological battery, Eldridge Sample was miles away, cold, damp, but resolutely focused. The hanging of Amos, and whatever subsequent discovery had caused that final scream, perhaps another body arranged or a vital store utterly despoiled, had served its purpose. He had shattered their morale, turned their fear inward, made them jump at their own shadows. Now, it was time to transition from ghostly harassment to a more systematic dismantling of their remaining strength. The hit-and-run tactics of the past few days, while effective, were costly in terms of his own dwindling energy and ammunition. He needed a more sustainable strategy. His Union Army training whispered the answer: find the high ground, establish a superior firing position, and control the field. He needed a sniper's nest, a place from which he could observe their main lines of movement and pick off key targets at will, turning their own valley into a prison from which there was no escape. As the miserable, rain-swept day gave way to a fitful, moonless night, Sample moved with a new purpose. He scouted the steep, craggy ridges that formed the northern wall of Devil's Den, the area least frequented by the Rooks, who preferred the more accessible southern slopes and the familiar network of caves. His wound still pained him, a dull, throbbing ache, but the poultices of plantain and his own iron constitution were keeping infection at bay. Hours before dawn, he found it. A shallow cave, little more than a deep recess in a sheer rock face halfway up a precipitous cliff. It was screened by a thick growth of stunted, wind-twisted cedars and a curtain of ancient ivy, making it virtually invisible from below. The approach was treacherous, a narrow, crumbling ledge that would deter all but the most determined climber. but its strategic value was immense. It offered a commanding, panoramic view of almost the entire Devil's Den, the main trail that snaked along the creek bed, the cluster of cabins that formed the Rook encampment, even the fortified entrance to the citadel itself. From here, with the Henry rifle, he could dominate their world. He spent the remainder of the darkness fortifying his position. He cleared away loose stones that might betray his presence, arranged a few larger rocks to create a stable rifle rest and provide additional cover, and carefully pruned a few branches of ivy to create narrow firing apertures. He had a clear line of retreat, up the ledge, and over the ridge if necessary. This would be his kingdom of the hunter. As the first gray light of dawn crept into the valley, Sample was in position, invisible, patient as the stone around him. He watched Devil's Den slowly come to life. He saw the remaining Rook clansmen, their numbers noticeably depleted, their movements no longer swaggering but furtive and fearful, emerging from their cabins. They moved in pairs or small groups, rarely alone, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods. The previous day's psychological blows had clearly taken their toll. Sample didn't fire immediately. He observed. He cataloged their routines, identified the key figures among the survivors. He saw Caleb, his face a mask of sleeplessness and rage, trying to rally the men, his voice strained. He saw Mordecai, his brute strength now undermined by a visible unease. He noted the pathways they used most frequently, the times they gathered for meals or to receive orders. His first target, chosen with cold deliberation later that morning, was a man named Silas, one of the older, more influential clan members, who also seemed to be one of their best remaining trackers. Silas had been vocal about the Marshal being a haint, and his fear was undermining what little discipline Caleb was trying to impose. Sample watched him lead a small party of 3 down the main trail toward the western end of the valley, perhaps to check traps or scout for any sign of the Marshal. The distance was nearly 500 yards. Sample took his time, the Henry resting solidly. He waited until Silas paused on an open stretch of trail, conferring with his companions. The rifle cracked, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the valley. Silas clutched his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face, and pitched forward into the dirt. His 2 companions, yelping in terror, scrambled for cover, firing wildly into the opposite hillside, far from Sample's concealed position. They then dragged Silas's body back towards the encampment, their desperate haste a testament to their fear. The effect on the clan was immediate and profound. Another death, another unseen bullet from an impossible distance. Their sanctuary was no longer safe. It had become a killing ground. They were trapped. Any movement along the main trail, any venture out from the relative safety of their cabins or the citadel, invited sudden, inexplicable death. Later that day, Sample picked off another Rook, a burly man named Jeb, who was attempting to fortify a watch post near the citadel entrance. The bullet took him in the head, and he toppled from the crude barricade like a discarded sack. Panic erupted. Men ran for the cover of the caves, their rifles firing haphazardly at the impassive cliffs. The Rooks realized with a chilling certainty that they were caught in a deadly vice. The Marshal wasn't just a random threat in the woods anymore. He was a calculating executioner, perched somewhere above them like an avenging angel, holding the power of life and death over their entire valley. They couldn't find him, they couldn't fight him, and they couldn't easily escape him. The main routes out of Devil's Den were now under his rifle's dominion. Fear, thick and cloying, settled over the Rook encampment. The men huddled in the smoky confines of the citadel, their bravado gone, replaced by whispered fears and bitter accusations. Even the hardened women of the clan looked pale and haunted. Food and water, normally gathered from the valley, became perilous expeditions. Caleb Rook, his authority in tatters, paced the main cavern like a caged animal, his frustration and impotence a burning acid in his gut. "We have to get out of here," he finally roared, his voice echoing desperation. "He's picking us off, one by one. We go over the high ridges, split up, lose him in the back country." "And go where, Caleb?" Mordecai challenged, his own face gray with strain. "This is our home. Besides, he's up there somewhere," he gestured vaguely towards the cliffs, "watching every move we make. How many of us will he kill before we even clear the valley?" Ezekiel Rook, who had been sitting silently by the fire, his eyes like dying embers, slowly rose. The systematic slaughter of his kin, the transformation of his impregnable fortress into a death trap, had pushed him to a precipice. The Marshal's relentless, unseen assault was an affront to everything he was, everything he had built. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raspy, freighted with a lifetime of violence and a dawning terrible madness. "No. We don't run." He glared at his son and brother, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of his remaining clan. "We ain't rabbits to be flushed and shot. This is Rook land. If he wants a war in our den, then by God we'll give him one he won't forget." His hand went to the long knife at his belt, his knuckles white. "We draw the devil out." Chapter 17. Draw the devil out. Caleb Rook stared at his father, a flicker of horrified disbelief in his eyes. "Pa, have you gone clean out of your mind? He's up on them cliffs like a hawk in a storm. He'll pick us apart before we even see him. We try to draw him out, we're just serving ourselves up on a platter." Ezekiel Rook, his ancient frame rigid with a newfound terrible energy, rounded on his son, his eyes blazing with a wild, almost feral light. "Platter?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering over stone. "We are Rooks. We don't scurry and hide like frightened rats in our own den. That thing out there, that ain't no Marshal. That's a judgment, a punishment for weakness." His gaze darted around the smoke-filled cavern, fixing on the pale, unnerved faces of his remaining kinsmen. "He feeds on fear. Your fear. It makes him stronger." The old man's sanity, already battered by Sample's relentless campaign of terror, was visibly crumbling. The systematic destruction of his clan, the transformation of his impenetrable sanctuary into a death trap, had pushed him beyond the edge of reason. He was a wounded patriarch, a king whose kingdom was dissolving before his eyes, and his response was not cunning, but a descent into a violent paranoid madness. His first desperate move came within the hour. He grabbed a terrified young clansman, a boy named Billy Joe barely old enough to shave, who had been caught hoarding a small stash of jerked venison. "Thief!" Ezekiel shrieked, dragging the boy into the center of the cavern. "Stealing from your own kin while a devil bleeds us dry. Maybe you've been leaving tokens for him too, eh? Signals." Before anyone could intervene, before Caleb could even process what was happening, Ezekiel drew the long, wicked knife from his belt. Billy Joe, his eyes wide with incomprehension and terror, stammered, "No, Pa Rook, I swear. I was just hungry." "Liar." Ezekiel's voice was a venomous hiss. With a swift, brutal motion, he slit the boy's throat. Billy Joe gurgled, clutching at the sudden, shocking wound, and collapsed at Ezekiel's feet, his lifeblood pooling on the cavern floor. A collective gasp of horror went through the remaining Rooks. This was not justice, this was madness. They had lived by violence, dealt in death. But this, a patriarch slaughtering one of his own on a flimsy, paranoid pretext, was a new and terrifying abyss. The fear of Sample outside was suddenly matched by the fear of Ezekiel within. "See." Ezekiel panted, wiping his bloody knife on his leggings, his chest heaving. "See how weakness invites the knife. There's traitors among us. Cowards. They're the ones drawing the Marshal's fire bringing this curse down on us." The family's fragile unity, already strained to the breaking point by Sample's unseen war, now shattered completely. The implicit trust that had bound them, the rough code of loyalty to kin, evaporated in the face of Ezekiel's homicidal paranoia. Men who had once feared only outside law now looked at their own leader, their own blood, with suspicion and dread. Old grudges, petty jealousies, and deep-seated rivalries, long suppressed under Ezekiel's iron rule, began to explode into open violence. Later that day, two cousins, Harker and Ben, who had a long-standing feud over a stolen horse and a woman from a distant settlement, got into a furious argument. Accusations flew, Harker claiming Ben was too cowardly to stand a proper watch, Ben retorting that Harker was hoarding ammunition. The argument escalated to shoves, then fists. In the tense, fear-soaked atmosphere, no one dared intervene. The brawl ended when Harker, his face a mask of rage, drew his skinning knife and plunged it into Ben's gut. Ben fell, screaming, and Harker stood over him, panting, his eyes wild, before fleeing into the deeper recesses of the caves, perhaps fearing Ezekiel's mad justice or the retribution of Ben's few remaining friends. Caleb watched this ugly spectacle with a growing sense of despair and revulsion. His father was lost to madness, his clan was tearing itself apart, and the relentless, unseen Marshal continued his deadly work from the heights. Devil's Den had become a true hell, a pressure cooker of fear, suspicion, and blood. Ezekiel, far from being sobered by the infighting, seemed to revel in it, seeing it as a purging of the weak. He roamed the citadel, his knife always in hand, his eyes darting everywhere, muttering about conspiracies and betrayals. He accused his own brother, Mordecai, of thinking too much like that Marshal, of trying to usurp his authority. Mordecai, a man of brute strength but simple loyalty, was stunned into silence, his face a mixture of confusion and hurt, backing away from the patriarch's insane accusations. The rock of the Rook Clan was crumbling from within. The few remaining women of the clan, their faces etched with terror, huddled together with the captive women, their shared fear blurring the lines between oppressor and oppressed. They whispered prayers, not for deliverance by some outside force, but for protection from their own men, their own kin. Sample, from his sniper's nest, continued his grim tally. He didn't need to fire often now. The Rooks were doing his work for him. He saw the smoke from their fires lessen as discipline collapsed. He heard the shouts of arguments, the occasional scream that was not cut short by a rifle shot, but by some internal brutality. He saw fewer and fewer Rooks venture out into the valley, and those who did moved with the haunted, desperate air of men already dead. Ezekiel's next desperate move was to try and counter Sample's unseen attacks with fire. He ordered his remaining able-bodied men, a pitifully small group now, to gather brush and timber and set massive bonfires at the base of the cliffs where he imagined the Marshal might be hiding. "Burn him out," he shrieked, his voice hoarse. "Smoke the devil from his hole." The fires cast a lurid, flickering glow over Devil's Den, the thick, acrid smoke choking the valley, but they did nothing to deter Sample, who was high above the worst of it, his position well chosen. The fires only served to further illuminate the Rook's desperation, making them easier targets if Sample chose to fire, and depleting their already scarce resources of wood. One evening, as Ezekiel raved by one of his pyres, his silhouette a demonic figure against the flames, he suddenly pointed a trembling finger at a young clansman named Zeke, who bore a passing resemblance to one of the lawmen whose bones lay in the citadel's refuse heap. "You!" Ezekiel screamed. "You got his eyes. The eyes of the law. You're one of them. Sent to spy." Before Zeke could react, before Caleb or a horrified Mordecai could move, Ezekiel lunged, his long knife flashing in the firelight. Zeke cried out, a choked, despairing sound as the blade found its mark. He fell into the edge of the bonfire, his clothes igniting, his screams a final agonizing punctuation to the utter dissolution of the Rook clan. The remaining few clansmen stared, not in anger but in numb, abject terror. Their patriarch, the man who had led them, protected them in his own brutal way, was now their most immediate and unpredictable threat. Caleb Rook watched his father, a madman capering by the flames, his kinfolk slaughtered by an unseen enemy, and their own deranged leader. The stench of fear, blood, and burning flesh filled Devil's Den. There was no order here, no sanctuary, only a vortex of death. He had to get out. He had to escape, not just the Marshal, but the consuming madness of his own blood. As Ezekiel Rook threw back his head and let out a wild, triumphant howl that echoed off the silent, watching cliffs, Caleb made his decision. Chapter 18. The acrid smoke of the bonfires mingled with the stench of fear and spilled blood, a choking miasma that filled Devil's Den. Caleb Rook watched his father, Ezekiel, capering like a demented prophet before the flames, his wild howls echoing off the silent, watching cliffs where the unseen Marshal held dominion. Zeke's smoldering corpse lay at the edge of the pyre, a gruesome testament to the utter madness that had consumed the Rook patriarch. What was left of the clan, a mere handful of terrified, broken men, huddled in the shadows of the citadel, their eyes wide with a terror that transcended even their fear of the relentless sniper. Caleb felt a cold knot of despair tighten in his own gut. This was no longer his family, his clan, his unassailable fortress. It was a charnel house, a madhouse, presided over by a lunatic and besieged by a ghost who dealt death with chilling precision. His empire of fear, built on brutality and intimidation, had crumbled to ash, consumed by an even greater fear and a more cunning brutality. To stay meant certain death, either at the hands of the Marshal, or by the increasingly unpredictable violence of his own kin, or worst of all, at the whim of his insane father. His decision, once made, was acted upon with the desperate stealth of a cornered animal. As the camp finally fell into an exhausted, uneasy quiet, an hour before what should have been dawn, with Ezekiel having collapsed into a snoring heap near the dying embers of his mad pyre, Caleb made his move. He gathered what few provisions he could carry without raising suspicion: a small sack of parched corn and dried meat, his own remaining ammunition, a full waterskin, and the heavy dragoon revolver he had retrieved from his cache in the caverns. His rifle he reluctantly left behind. It was too cumbersome for the swift, silent flight he envisioned. He chose his escape route with care, a path he hadn't used in years, a treacherous goat trail that wound its way up the steep southern escarpment of Devil's Den. It was a difficult, almost forgotten track, one he believed the Marshal, with his focus on the main valley and the northern ridges, would not have anticipated. He would head south, deep into the wildest, most uninhabited stretches of the Ozarks, lose himself in the trackless wilderness, and then perhaps make his way west, towards Indian territory, where a man with his skills could disappear and start anew. He slipped from the citadel like a shadow, his massive frame moving with an uncharacteristic lightness, his ears straining for any sound of alarm. The few sentries still posted were either asleep or too lost in their own private terrors to notice his departure. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, pregnant with unspoken dread. The climb was arduous, the trail barely discernible in the pre-dawn gloom. Loose scree shifted under his boots, threatening to send him tumbling into the abyss below. His breath rasped in his throat, his heart pounded, but the image of his father's madness and the relentless, unseen rifle of the Marshal spurred him onward. He was Caleb Rook, the bull of the woods, the man who had terrorized a county. He would not be brought down like a common dog. As the first, faint tendrils of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky, he reached what he believed to be the last significant obstacle on his chosen path: a narrow defile, a natural cut through the ridgeline that offered the only passage south for miles. He remembered it from his youth, a tight squeeze but passable. He approached it cautiously, his hand on the butt of his dragoon. And then he saw it. Blocking the narrowest point of the defile was a freshly felled pine tree, its trunk thicker than his own body. It hadn't fallen naturally. The cut at its base was clean, made by an axe, and recently. Its branches, a dense, impenetrable tangle, completely choked the passage. A cold dread, far deeper than any fear he had known during the past few days, washed over Caleb. This was no accident. The tree had been placed there deliberately, methodically. He scrambled up the side of the defile, his eyes scanning the opposite slope, searching for any sign of the axeman, any hint of movement. Nothing. Only the silent, watching trees and the cold, indifferent stone. He tried another route, a game trail that branched off further west, one that led to a series of precarious ledges he knew could eventually take him over the ridge. An hour of desperate scrambling, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming, brought him to the head of that trail. It too was blocked. Not by a tree this time, but by a carefully constructed rock slide, a ton of shale and boulders that had been deliberately dislodged from the slope above, creating an impassable barrier. Above the rock slide, etched into the trunk of a blighted oak with the point of a knife, was a single, chillingly familiar symbol, a pair of scales perfectly balanced. Sample. The realization struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. The marshal hadn't just been picking them off from his sniper's nest. He had been thinking, planning, anticipating. While the rooks had been descending into madness and internecine slaughter, Sample had been methodically sealing their doom, cutting off every conceivable escape route from Devil's Den. He had herded them, manipulated them, and now he was closing the trap. For the first time in his life, Caleb Rook felt truly, utterly trapped. He was a beast in a cage, a bull with a ring through its nose, led to a destination not of his choosing. His usual tactics, the roar of command, the threat of violence, the brutal application of his immense strength, were useless against this invisible, calculating foe. He could not intimidate a man he could not see. He could not crush an enemy who fought with intellect and patience rather than brute force. He sank onto a rock, the dragoon heavy and useless in his hand. He looked out over the rugged, unforgiving landscape of his family's domain, now his prison. The vast wilderness that had once been his ally, his shield, now seemed to press in on him, its silence mocking his plight. He felt an unfamiliar emotion rise within him, something akin to despair, but shot through with a cornered animal's desperate rage. He thought of his father, his clan, their bloody legacy, all of it brought to ruin by one man, one implacable force of retribution. He had faced dangerous men before, outlaws, rival gangs, even the occasional determined lawman. He had always prevailed through cunning, through brutality, through the sheer terror his name inspired. But Eldridge Sample was different. He was more than just skilled, more than just ruthless. He was a reckoning. Caleb slammed his fist against the unyielding stone, a wordless snarl of frustration tearing from his throat. He was still a powerful man, a dangerous man. He wouldn't just lie down and die. If the marshal wanted him, he would have to come and get him. He would make him fight on his terms, in close, where strength and savagery still mattered. He rose, his eyes scanning the silent, watching trees. He was trapped, yes, but he was not yet broken. The game was not over. He still had teeth, still had claws. As he began to make his way back down towards the valley, a new, desperate cunning hardening his features, he heard it, a faint sound carried on the morning breeze. The distant, solitary crack of a rifle. It wasn't aimed at him, not yet. It was a message, a reminder. The marshal was out there, watching, waiting, controlling the board. And Caleb Rook knew, with a chilling certainty, that the next move was his, a move that could well be his last. Chapter 19. "So that's your game, Marshal?" Caleb Rook's voice, a ragged growl chewed out between clenched teeth, was barely a whisper against the vast indifferent silence of the Ozark peaks. The distant rifle shot, that cold, deliberate message from his unseen tormentor, still echoed in his mind. "Think you got me penned? Think I'll just lie down and die quiet?" He spat onto the rocky ground. His eyes, bloodshot and burning with a desperate feral light, scanned the towering bluffs and shadowed ravines that surrounded him. "This is my hell you're dancing in, Sample. And I know every damn step." With that raw, defiant declaration, the true and final contest began. A deadly game of hide-and-seek played out across the most treacherous, unforgiving guts of the Ozark wilderness. Devil's Den, with its specific confines, had been a cage. This wild, broken country was a sprawling three-dimensional maze where only the most cunning or the most ruthless could hope to survive. Eldridge Sample, lean and gaunt, his left arm a constant throb of pain beneath its crude bandage, moved with the patient, deadly grace of a seasoned wolf. His Union Army training had forged him into an instrument of relentless pursuit and calculated violence, but it had also taught him the bitter lessons of endurance, the necessity of husbanding his strength, his ammunition, his very will to live. He knew Caleb Rook was no ordinary outlaw. He was a creature of these mountains, strong as a cornered bear, possessed of an animal cunning, and an intimate knowledge of every secret path, every hidden spring, every defensible rockfall. Caleb, for his part, was driven by a primal fury, and the dawning, terrifying realization that his reign of brutality was truly over unless he could eliminate the one man who had systematically dismantled his world. He was wounded in spirit more than flesh, his arrogance shattered, his authority in Devil's Den a smoldering ruin. But desperation lent him a renewed, albeit savage, focus. He abandoned any pretense of leading a clan. This was about his own survival, his own vengeance. The first days of this lethal dance were a blur of movement and near misses. Sample, using his superior fieldcraft, attempted to track Caleb, to anticipate his direction, to maneuver him into a disadvantageous position. He read the signs: a hastily broken branch, the faint scuff of a boot on stone, the nervous chatter of a disturbed squirrel, with the meticulous attention that had kept him alive through countless campaigns. He set up small, clever ambushes along likely routes, conserving his precious cartridges for a sure shot. But Caleb was no fool in these his own hills. He moved erratically, doubling back on his trail, wading through long stretches of fast-flowing creeks to mask his scent, using ancient overgrown game trails that even most of his own clan had forgotten. He relied on instinct, on a lifetime spent absorbing the rhythms and secrets of the wilderness. He too set traps, crude, brutal affairs designed to maim or cripple. Once, Sample's keen eye caught the almost invisible tautness of a rawhide tripwire stretched across a narrow deer path, connected to a precariously balanced deadfall of heavy logs. Another time, he discovered a shallow pit, its bottom lined with sharpened stakes, cunningly concealed beneath a carpet of leaves on what appeared to be solid ground. Their brief, vicious firefights erupted with shocking suddenness, usually at dusk or dawn when the light was tricky and shadows played tricks on the eyes. A fleeting glimpse of movement, a glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel, and the silent wilderness would explode with the roar of gunfire. Lead whined off rocks, tore through bark, and kicked up spurts of dust as both men sought whatever scant cover the terrain offered. These were not prolonged battles, but sharp, brutal exchanges, each man knowing that a sustained fight would likely be fatal. After a few shots, one or the other would disengage, melting back into the labyrinth of trees and stone, the echoes of their gunfire a stark reminder of the deadly stakes. Both men were wounded, both were exhausted. Sample's arm wound, though kept clean, continued to sap his strength, and the lack of proper food was beginning to hollow his cheeks, etch new lines of hardship around his pale, intense eyes. Caleb, driven by a furious energy, was also wearing down. The constant vigilance, the knowledge that a single mistake could mean a bullet from an unseen rifle, frayed his nerves. His once imposing bulk seemed to carry a new weariness, his movements lacking their former bullish confidence. One scorching afternoon, Sample, conserving his energy in the scant shade of a rock overhang, watched Caleb move across a distant, sun-baked scree slope. The big man was clearly suffering from thirst, his movements becoming more labored. Sample could have attempted a long shot, but his ammunition was perilously low, and a non-fatal hit would only make Caleb more desperate, more unpredictable. Instead, he employed a tactic learned from Apache scouts: misdirection. Earlier, he had found a small, hidden seep, a precious source of cool water. He had drunk his fill, then carefully muddied the area around it, leaving signs of a hasty departure heading east. He knew Caleb, if he found the seep, might be lulled into thinking Sample was further away and in a specific direction. Caleb, his throat parched, his tongue thick in his mouth, eventually stumbled upon the seep. He fell to his knees, gulping the cool water, his relief palpable even from Sample's distant vantage point. He saw the tracks, the signs of Sample's eastward movement, and a flicker of something, hope. Renewed determination crossed his grimy face. He rose, a new energy in his step, and headed east, deeper into a series of broken canyons and treacherous ravines that Sample had already scouted, a place where visibility was limited and ambush was a constant threat. Sample, however, had not gone east. He had circled wide to the north, using his knowledge of military flanking maneuvers, and was now positioned high on the rim of the very canyon system Caleb was entering. He watched his adversary push deeper into the rugged terrain, a fly entering a spider's carefully constructed web. The psychological toll of this relentless pursuit was as damaging as the physical. Days bled into nights, the landscape a monotonous canvas of greens and grays. The silence of the mountains pressed in, broken only by the rustle of wind, the cry of a hawk, or the sudden, terrifying crack of a rifle. Each man knew the other was out there, a constant, unseen presence, a silent promise of death. Sleep was a luxury neither could fully afford, snatched in brief, uneasy snatches, always with one ear open for the slightest sound. Caleb, relying on his animal cunning, began to leave more insidious signs for Sample. He would double back and watch his own trail, hoping to catch the marshal in pursuit. He left misleading tracks, trying to lure Sample into narrow box canyons or areas of dangerously unstable rock. Once he managed to trigger a small rock slide that thundered down a slope Sample had traversed only minutes before, a near miss that left the marshal's nerves raw, but his resolve unshaken. The Ozarks, ancient and indifferent, bore silent witness to their deadly ballet. The sun beat down, storms lashed the peaks, and the cold mountain nights bit deep, but neither man would yield. It had become more than a hunt for justice or a flight for survival. It was a primal contest of will, a stark distillation of predator and prey, played out in a wilderness that stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw essence of their conflict. As the sun began to dip below the western ridges, casting long, distorted shadows across a particularly wild and desolate gorge, Caleb Rook, feeling the walls of the wilderness closing in, his options dwindling, stumbled upon a narrow, almost hidden passage leading into a tight box canyon. He peered into its depths. It was a natural fortress, high-walled, with only one way in or out. A desperate, reckless idea began to form in his mind, a final gamble. He was tired of running, tired of the unseen threat. He would make his stand here. He would force the marshal to come to him. He looked back over his shoulder, a wild, hunted look in his eyes. Then, with a guttural snarl that was more animal than human, he plunged into the shadowy depths of the box canyon, preparing for the devil's due. Chapter 20. The box canyon was a grim, stone-toothed cul-de-sac, its sheer, unscalable walls pressing in on Caleb Rook like the jaws of a colossal trap. He had retreated here to this final, desperate sanctuary with the dregs of his once formidable clan. His uncle Mordecai, his face a mask of weary resignation, but his massive hands still clenching his rifle. A hardened, silent cousin named Isham, whose eyes held the dull gleam of a man who had nothing left to lose. And young Micah, barely a man who had followed Caleb more out of a terrified, ingrained loyalty than any real conviction, his face now pale and streaked with dirt and tears. 4 of them left, against a phantom who had decimated their ranks and shattered their reign. Caleb paced the narrow sandy floor of the canyon, his boots kicking up puffs of dust, his mind a maelstrom of fury, fear, and a desperate, clawing need to regain some semblance of control. His attempt to lure Sample into this confined space, to force a close-quarters confrontation on his own terms, had so far yielded nothing but an oppressive silence from the canyon rim above. The Marshal was out there, he knew it, watching, waiting, patient as death itself. "He ain't comin' in, Caleb," Mordecai rumbled, his voice hoarse. He sat slumped against the canyon wall, his rifle across his knees. "He's too smart for that. He'll just wait us out. Starve us out. Or pick us off, if we try to leave." "He'll come," Caleb snarled, though a cold knot of doubt was tightening in his own belly. "He wants me. He wants this to end." But the silence from above was unnerving, a testament to the Marshal's iron discipline. It was young Micah, his eyes wide with a different kind of alarm, who first spotted them. He had been posted as a reluctant lookout near the canyon's narrow mouth, more to keep him from deserting than for any real hope of spotting the Marshal. Caleb. Riders. Wagons. Comin' down the old trace, headin' this way. A spark of something dark and opportunistic ignited in Caleb Rook's desperate mind. The old trace Micah spoke of was a barely used, overgrown trail that skirted the southern edge of the ridge, passing perilously close to the mouth of their box canyon. It was rarely traveled, usually only by those hopelessly lost or foolishly seeking a shortcut through the treacherous mountains. This was an unexpected gift from fate, a final, desperate gambit. "Hostages," Caleb breathed the word a venomous hiss. A cruel, almost insane light leapt into his eyes. If the Marshal wouldn't come to him, he would force him. "Mordecai. Isham. With me. Micah, you stay here, keep watch on that rim. If you see so much as a hawk move, you fire." He led his 2 remaining stalwarts towards the canyon mouth, moving with a renewed, savage energy. They reached it just as the small wagon train, 2 canvas-topped wagons, a few outriders, and a handful of gaunt, weary-looking livestock lumbered into view. It was a pitiful sight. A small band of settlers, perhaps a family or 2, their faces etched with the hardships of the trail, their belongings meager. They were clearly ill-prepared for the savage realities of the Ozark backcountry. The Rooks burst from the canyon mouth with terrifying suddenness, their rifles blazing. The outriders, taken completely by surprise, had no chance. One fell from his horse with a cry, clutching his chest. Another, trying to wheel his mount, was shot from the saddle. The lead wagon's driver, a stout, bearded man, reached for a rifle, but a bullet from Caleb's dragoon smashed into his shoulder, sending him tumbling from his seat. Panic erupted. Women screamed from within the wagons. Children wailed. The remaining men, mostly farmers by the look of them, armed with old fowling pieces or nothing at all, were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, it was over. Caleb Rook, his face a mask of brutal triumph, surveyed his captives. He had a man, his arm bleeding profusely, his wife clinging to him in terror, an older woman, her face a stoic mask but her eyes filled with dread, and 2 children, a boy of about 10 and a girl a few years younger, both wide-eyed and sobbing. "Bring him into the canyon," Caleb roared, shoving the wounded man towards the narrow entrance. "Quickly, before that damn Marshal gets any ideas." High above, on the canyon rim, Eldridge Sample had watched the unfolding tragedy with a hardening of his already grim features. He had been tracking Caleb, expecting a confrontation, but this was a new level of depravity even for a rook. He had seen the wagon train approaching, had hoped they would pass by unharmed, but Caleb's desperate mind had seized the opportunity with horrifying speed. Sample had considered a shot, a desperate attempt to take Caleb out before he could secure the hostages. But the risk of hitting an innocent, the chaos of the ambush had stayed his hand. Now, the settlers were being herded into the very trap Caleb had intended for him. The demand, when it came, was bellowed up from the canyon floor by Caleb himself, his voice raw with a mixture of desperation and savage glee. "Marshal Sample, you hear me up there, you damn ghost? I got me some company. Innocent folk. Women. Children." He punctuated his words by firing his dragoon into the air, the sound echoing flatly off the stone walls. The children screamed anew. "You want 'em to live, Marshal? You want their blood off your hands? Then you show yourself. Come down here. Your rifle first. Then your sidearm. You come down here unarmed and surrender. You got 1 hour. 1 hour, Marshal, or these good people start to die. One by one. And their deaths will be on your head." Sample lay prone on the cliff edge, his Winchester resting before him, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He could see the scene below, the terrified hostages huddled together, Caleb and his remaining thugs menacing them, the sheer unyielding walls of the box canyon. His sniper's advantage, the cornerstone of his campaign against the Rooks, was nullified. If he fired now, he would undoubtedly hit a hostage. Caleb had played his last, desperate card, and it was a strong one. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sample with an almost physical force. His mission was to bring Caleb Rook and his murderous clan to justice, to end their reign of terror. He had sworn an oath. But could he sacrifice innocent lives to achieve that end? Could he stand by and listen to women and children die because he refused to yield his tactical advantage? He thought of Billy Hawkins, of the other lawmen whose bones lay in the citadel, of the countless unknown victims of the Rook clan's depravity. Justice demanded their end. But the terrified sobs of the children below, the stoic fear in the eyes of the captured women, spoke to a different, more immediate imperative. He knew what Caleb Rook was. A brutal close-quarters fighter, a savage who reveled in bloodshed. To go down there unarmed or lightly armed was to walk into Rook's arena, to play the game by Rook's rules, where strength and animal ferocity would likely prevail over skill and discipline. It was, in all probability, a death sentence. But the alternative was to listen to those screams turn into death rattles. His jaw tightened. There were lines a man didn't cross, not even in the pursuit of justice. He had hunted monsters, and in doing so, had sometimes walked dangerously close to becoming one himself. But he would not become one now. He would not sacrifice the innocent to slay the guilty. Slowly, deliberately, Eldridge Sample began to unbuckle his rifle belt. He laid the familiar weight of the Winchester aside. He checked the loads in his Colt, then holstered it. He would need that, at least for a chance. He rose, a solitary, determined figure against the vast, uncaring sweep of the Ozark sky. He looked down into the shadowy depths of the box canyon, where Caleb Rook waited, where innocence was held hostage by pure evil. Then, his decision made, he began the treacherous descent, abandoning his sniper's advantage, walking willingly into the devil's maw. Chapter 21. "Well now, Marshal Sample," Caleb Rook's voice boomed, laced with a savage, almost joyous triumph, as Eldridge Sample appeared at the narrow mouth of the box canyon, his silhouette stark against the pale light behind him. "Took you long enough. Started to think you didn't care much for these tender little lambs. He gestured with his dragoon revolver towards the terrified hostages huddled near the canyon wall, their faces pale with dread. "Dropped your rifle, I trust. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Sample's pale eyes, cold and unwavering as a winter sky, met Rook's. He said nothing, his hands held loosely at his sides, his Colt still holstered. He had descended into hell, and the devil himself stood before him, flanked by his last 3 disciples, Mordecai, massive and grim, Isham, lean and watchful, and young Micah, whose fear was a palpable aura. "No misunderstandings, Rook," Sample said finally, his voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Let the settlers go. This is between you and me." Caleb laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Oh, it's between you and me all right, Marshal. But these folks? They're my insurance. My guarantee that you fight fair, or at least by my rules." He took a step forward, his bulk casting a menacing shadow. "Now, your sidearm. Toss it over. Slow and easy." Sample's gaze didn't waver. He knew this was the critical juncture. To disarm completely was to invite immediate slaughter. He had to create an opening, a moment of chaos. "And if I don't?" "Then the little girl screams first," Caleb said, his smile all predator. He nodded towards Mordecai, who took a menacing step towards the hostages. In that instant, Sample moved. Not towards Rook, but with a sudden, explosive dive to his right, towards a jumble of fallen rocks that offered scant cover. His Colt cleared leather with the same blinding speed that had dispatched Jake Motley, spitting flame and thunder. His first shot was not aimed at Caleb, but at Micah, the youngest, the weakest link. The boy cried out, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground as he stumbled back. All hell broke loose. Mordecai roared, turning his rifle towards Sample. Isham fired wildly. Caleb, momentarily surprised by Sample's audacity, bellowed in rage. The hostages screamed, scrambling further back against the canyon wall. Sample, firing again from behind his rocks, knew he had seconds. Mordecai was the immediate threat, his rifle a deadly peril. Sample's next bullet caught the big man in the thigh. Mordecai howled in pain and fury, his shot going wide, but he remained standing, a wounded grizzly still capable of immense damage. Isham, more cautious, was trying to flank Sample, using the canyon wall for cover. This was no place for a prolonged gunfight with his limited ammunition. It had to be close, brutal, and fast. Sample rose from his cover in a low crouch, charging not towards Caleb, but towards the wounded Mordecai. He fired his Colt again, point blank, into Mordecai's chest as the giant Rook tried to bring his rifle to bear. Mordecai staggered, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, then crashed to the ground like a felled oak, his heavy body shaking the very earth. Isham, seeing his kinsman fall, let out a yell of rage and charged, his hunting knife glinting. Sample, his Colt now empty, met him head-on. There was no room for finesse, no time for thought, only brutal primal instinct. Sample sidestepped Isham's wild knife thrust, the blade whistling past his ear, and drove his fist into the man's throat. Isham gagged, his eyes bulging, and Sample followed with a vicious knee to the groin. As Isham doubled over, Sample brought the empty barrel of his Colt down in a savage arc against the side of the man's head. Isham dropped like a Polack steer. 2 down. But Caleb was now upon him, a snarling, raging behemoth. The big dragoon revolver roared, the bullet plucking at Sample's sleeve as he twisted away. There was no time to reload. Sample threw his empty Colt at Caleb's face, a desperate distraction. Caleb flinched, batting it away. And in that instant, Sample closed the distance, driving his shoulder into Rook's midsection. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury, the dust rising around them. All pretense of civilized combat vanished, replaced by a raw, savage struggle for survival. Caleb's massive hands clawed for Sample's throat, his thumbs digging deep. Sample, gasping for breath, brought his knee up sharply into Caleb's side, rewarded by a grunt of pain and a momentary loosening of the chokehold. He rolled free, scrambling to his feet, his lungs burning. Caleb was slower to rise, but his face was a mask of contorted fury, his eyes blazing with murderous intent. He still had the dragoon, but in the close confines of their struggle, it was more a hindrance than a help. He bellowed and charged again, swinging the heavy pistol like a club. Sample dodged the blow, the barrel whistling past his head, and landed a hard right to Caleb's jaw. The force of the blow would have felled a lesser man, but Caleb merely shook his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and came on again. The fight became a brutal, desperate dance across the canyon floor. Fists flew, landing with sickening thuds. They grappled, their bodies straining, each man trying to overpower the other. Sample, though giving away 50 pounds in weight, was quicker, his movements honed by years of hard living and countless brawls. He used Caleb's own momentum against him, sidestepping charges, delivering short, chopping blows to vulnerable points. Caleb, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, roared inarticulately, and managed to get a bare hug on Sample, his massive arms threatening to crush the marshal's ribs. Sample, his vision blurring, slammed his forehead into Caleb's nose. Cartilage crunched and blood spurted. Caleb howled in pain, his grip loosening, and Sample wrenched himself free. The fight was now drifting towards the steeper, broken talus slopes at the base of the canyon walls. Their guns were lost or forgotten, their ammunition spent. It was down to knives, fists, and whatever makeshift weapons the unforgiving terrain offered. Caleb, blood streaming from his shattered nose, his eyes wild, drew a long, wicked skinning knife from his belt. Sample, his own knife lost during his earlier escape, snatched up a jagged piece of rock. They circled each other, panting, streaked with dirt, sweat, and blood, their own and each other's. The hostages watched in terrified silence, forgotten for the moment, as the two titans battled for supremacy. Caleb lunged, his knife a silver blur. Sample parried the thrust with his rock-armed hand, the impact jarring his already wounded arm, but he held firm. He brought the rock down on Caleb's knife hand. Bones crunched, and Caleb roared in agony, the knife clattering to the ground. Enraged beyond reason, Caleb ignored the pain in his mangled hand and charged again, a purely bestial assault. He tackled Sample, and both men went tumbling down a short, steep section of the scree slope, rocks scattering around them. They landed in a heap, Sample momentarily stunned. Caleb, fueled by a madman's strength, was on top of him, his remaining good hand scrabbling for Sample's eyes, his throat. Sample twisted, bucked, trying to dislodge the heavier man. He felt Caleb's foul breath on his face, saw the insane glitter in his eyes. This was it, the primal struggle, life and death measured in heartbeats. He managed to get his legs free, and slammed his heel into Caleb's kidney. Caleb grunted, his body arching, and Sample used the momentary respite to throw him off. Both men scrambled to their feet, exhausted, battered, bleeding from a dozen cuts and bruises. They were on a narrow ledge now, halfway up the canyon wall, the ground falling away precipitously below them. The fight had ranged from the canyon floor to this treacherous perch. There was no room to maneuver, no escape. One false step meant a fatal plunge. Caleb, his face a bloody, unrecognizable mask of hatred, gathered himself for one final, desperate charge. He lowered his head like a maddened bull, intending to drive Sample off the ledge to his death. Sample stood his ground, his legs braced, his eyes never leaving Rook's, every fiber of his being focused on this ultimate confrontation. The devil was making his last rush. Chapter 22. Caleb Rook's final, desperate charge on the narrow, treacherous ledge was a purely bestial explosion of rage and hate. He came at Eldridge Sample like a maddened bull, his head lowered, his one good hand clawed, intending to drive the marshal over the precipice into the jagged rocks far below. Sample, battered, bleeding, Every muscle screaming in protest stood his ground, a sliver of stone his only footing between life and a fatal plunge. There was no room for maneuver, no space for skill, only a brutal collision of exhausted bodies. As Rook slammed into him, Sample pivoted, not away from the cliff edge, but towards it, using Rook's own furious momentum. For a horrifying instant, both men teetered on the brink, the abyss yawning at their heels. Sample, with a last, desperate surge of strength born of pure will, twisted his body and drove his knee hard into Rook's already injured side. Rook roared, a sound of agony and frustrated fury, his balance compromised. His arms windmilled wildly, his eyes wide with a sudden, stark terror as he felt his footing give way on the loose scree. He clawed at Sample, trying to drag him down too, but Sample threw himself sideways, collapsing onto the narrow ledge, scraping fresh wounds against the rough rock. Caleb Rook, the tyrant of Devil's Den, the man who had terrorized a county and reveled in brutality, toppled backward into empty space. His scream, a drawn-out, ululating cry of disbelief and ultimate terror, echoed once off the canyon walls, then was abruptly cut short by a sickening final thud from the canyon floor far below. Silence descended, broken only by Sample's ragged gasping for air and the distant terrified whimpers of the hostages. He lay there for long moments, every inch of his body a symphony of pain. His vision swam. Blood, his own and Rook's, matted his torn clothes and stung his numerous cuts. He was alive, but only just. The devil had claimed his due. Slowly, groaning with the effort, Sample pushed himself up. He peered over the ledge. Caleb Rook lay sprawled on the rocks below, a broken, misshapen heap, as still and lifeless as the stones that cradled him. The reign of the Ozark devil was over. But his evil, Sample knew, was a stain that would not easily wash away. It was etched into the faces of the traumatized settlers, into the scarred landscape of Devil's Den, into the very soul of Cypress Hollow. It would linger in the nightmares of the survivors, and in the dark legends whispered around lonely frontier campfires for generations to come. His first duty was to the living. With agonizing effort, Sample made his way back down the treacherous cliff face to the canyon floor. He found young Micah Rook, the last of Caleb's kin in the canyon, cowering behind a rock, the fight having drained completely out of him. The boy looked up at Sample with wide, terrified eyes, expecting death. Sample merely gestured with the barrel of the dragoon he'd retrieved from where Caleb had dropped it. "Get up. Go see to your kin." He had no more bullets for the living Rooks, and no more fight left in him for the boy. Justice had been served on the main architects of this evil. He approached the hostages, who stared at him with a mixture of awe, fear, and dawning relief. The wounded man, his face pale, managed a weak, grateful nod. "Thank you, mister, thank you." "Get your people, get your wagons," Sample rasped, his voice raw. "Leave this place. Don't look back. There's nothing for you here but bad memories." He helped them gather what they could, his movements stiff and painful. He found them water, shared the last of his meager rations. He saw the profound trauma in their eyes, the shadows that would likely never leave them. The evil of the Rooks had left its indelible scars. Once the settlers were safely on their way, their wagons creaking slowly out of the cursed canyon, Sample turned his attention to the Rook citadel. He was operating on sheer will now, his body screaming for rest, for healing. But there was one last task. He had to see, he had to know the full extent of the darkness he had confronted. He entered the main cavern, the fire pit now cold, the air thick with the stench of stale fear and recent death. The bodies of Mordecai and Isham lay where they had fallen. He passed them without a glance. His exploration took him deeper into the warren of caves, into the hidden chambers where the Rook Clan had lived and plotted and carried out their monstrous deeds. What he found there, in those lightless, fetid recesses, went beyond mere plunder and cruelty. He found alcoves that had clearly been used as cells, with heavy iron rings bolted into the stone, chains still attached. He found crude, terrifying instruments whose purpose he could only guess at, things that spoke of systematic torture. In one particularly remote chamber, reached by a passage so narrow he had to squeeze through sideways, the air was thick with an almost unbearable stench. By the flickering light of a salvaged torch he saw it, a deep pit, and within it, a horrifying, jumbled mass of human skeletal remains, far more numerous than the few bones he had glimpsed before. These weren't just the remains of a few unfortunate lawmen. This was a charnel pit, evidence of countless victims, travelers, settlers, perhaps even recalcitrant clan members, their lives extinguished and their bodies discarded like so much refuse. He found crude ledgers hidden beneath a loose stone, filled with horrifyingly meticulous entries, names, dates, descriptions of acquisitions that were clearly kidnapped individuals, some marked with notations that made his blood run cold. This was not just a family of outlaws. It was an organized criminal enterprise, specializing in human misery on a scale he had scarcely imagined. The depth of their depravity was staggering, a darkness so profound it seemed to contaminate the very rock around him. Eldridge Sample, a man hardened by war and a decade of hunting the worst humanity had to offer, felt a cold wave of nausea. Some things were too evil to be understood, too corrupt to be simply punished by the law. The world, he decided, did not need to know the full, specific horrors that had transpired in this cursed place. To expose it would be to risk spreading its contagion, to feed a morbid fascination that could only breed more darkness. Some secrets, he realized with a grim certainty, were too dark to survive. Their poison had to be neutralized, their memory cauterized from the earth. His decision was swift, born of a cold, righteous fury and a profound weariness. He began to gather combustible materials, the Rook's furs, their crude furniture, the remnants of their stolen goods, even the pages of their vile ledgers. He worked with a grim, methodical purpose, piling it all in the center of the main cavern. He used the last of their lamp oil to help it catch. When he was done, he stood at the entrance to the citadel, a solitary, battered figure, and threw the torch onto the pyre. The flames caught slowly at first, then roared to life, a hungry orange beast consuming the heart of the Rook Clan's evil. Smoke, thick and black, billowed from the cave mouth, carrying the stench of their corruption out into the clear Ozark air. Sample watched for a long time as the fire raged, a cleansing inferno. He felt no triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion and the bitter taste of ashes in his mouth. He had faced the devil in his den and emerged barely victorious. But the battle had scarred him, body and soul. As the roof of the main cavern began to groan under the intense heat, threatening collapse, Eldridge Sample turned his back on the burning mountain and began the long, painful journey out of Devil's Den, leaving behind him only fire and secrets too dark for the light of day. Chapter 23. Good Lord in heaven, is that him? The whisper, thin and reedy as an autumn wind through dry cornstalks, came from the shadowed doorway of Keller's general store. Old man Keller himself stood there, his spectacles askew, his face a parchment of disbelief and a dawning incredulous hope. It's Marshal Sample. By all that's holy, he's come back. The figure that limped down the dusty, sun-baked main street of Cypress Hollow bore only a passing resemblance to the hard, implacable lawman who had ridden in weeks before. Eldridge Sample was a scarecrow silhouette, gaunt and hollow-cheeked, his clothes shredded and stained with dirt and dried blood, his own and that of others. A crudely bandaged arm was still stiff, and he moved with the profound weariness of a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and barely clawed his way back. Yet his pale eyes, though sunken and haunted, still held that core of unyielding iron. His return was not met with cheers or fanfare. Instead, a hush fell over Cypress Hollow, a silence as profound as the one that had greeted his first arrival, but this time imbued with a different quality, not the oppressive dread of Rook's reign, but a stunned, hesitant curiosity, a fragile hope too terrified to fully unfurl its wings. Windows that had been slammed shut now creaked open. Doors that had been barred were unlatched. Faces, pale and wary, peered out. The town was, indeed, beginning to heal, though the wounds were still raw and deep. Keller's store had a few more dusty cans on its shelves, a bolt of new calico bravely displayed in the grimy window. Murphy's livery, its sagging roof now patched in one corner, had two unfamiliar horses tethered outside. And old Patrick Murphy himself was visible, slowly currying a mare, his hands still trembling, but with less of the ague-like fear that had previously gripped him. Even the Broken Wheel Saloon, though no music yet spilled from its bat-wing doors, had its windows open, airing out the stale ghosts of fear and despair. Life, like a stubborn wildflower pushing through scorched earth, was tentatively reasserting itself. Sample walked the length of the street, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the lingering shadows in people's eyes, the way they still flinched at sudden movements, the hesitation before they met his gaze. Trust, he knew, would be a slow, reluctant bloom in this blighted soil. He stopped before the jailhouse, its stone walls seeming to absorb the harsh midday sun. Rook's office. Billy Hawkins's tomb. He stared at it for a long moment, the memories of the past weeks a bitter tide in his mind. Old Man Keller was the first to approach him, his steps shuffling but determined. "Marshal," he ventured, his voice cracking. Is it truly over? Is Rook?" Sample turned, his face unreadable. "Rook's dead," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "His clan is broken. They won't be troubling Cypress Hollow again." The words, stark and unequivocal, seemed to hang in the air. A few more townsfolk crept closer, drawn by the quiet certainty in his tone. Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had been one of Rook's early victims, her face a web of grief, clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders, her eyes searching Sample's. "All of them?" she whispered. "The whole nest of vipers?" "Enough of them," Sample replied, the image of the burning citadel, the charnel pit, flashing in his mind. Some truths were best left buried with the dead. Devil's Den is cleansed. He saw the doubt still warring with hope in their faces. They had lived under Rook's shadow for so long that the idea of its absence was almost too much to grasp. He reached into his saddlebag, retrieved from where he'd left his horse with Murphy before venturing into the mountains, and pulled out a familiar object, Caleb Rook's tarnished sheriff's badge. He held it out to Keller. "This belongs to the town now, I reckon. Or to the county. You'll need to find a new lawman. An honest one this time." The sight of the badge, Rook's symbol of power and corruption now offered up so plainly, seemed to break through some of their reserve. A few people gasped. Old Man Keller took it with a trembling hand, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. He really ain't coming back?" a young farmer asked, his voice filled with a childlike wonder. "He's not coming back," Sample confirmed. He looked at their faces, seeing the first stirrings of genuine relief, the slow unclenching of fear's icy grip. But he also saw the deep weariness, the invisible scars that mirrored his own. His own psychological wounds from the mountain ordeal were a heavy burden. The nights were the worst, filled with fragmented images of violence, the faces of the dead, the chilling echo of Ezekiel's madness. During the long, solitary ride back from the smoldering ruins of Devil's Den, he had relived every brutal encounter, every desperate choice. He had looked into the abyss of human depravity, and a part of that darkness had inevitably settled within him. He was a man who had matched brutality with brutality, and while the cause was just, the methods left their own taint. Patrick Murphy approached, leading Sample's rested bay gelding. The old liveryman's eyes, though still carrying a haunted look, held a newfound respect, a tentative gratitude. "Your horse is ready, Marshal. Fed and watered. You look like you've seen the far side of hell." Something like that, Murphy, Sample said, taking the reins. He swung himself into the saddle, his movements stiff, each one an effort. The familiar feel of the horse beneath him was a small comfort. He needed to leave Cypress Hollow. He had done what he came to do. Rook was dead, his clan shattered. The town had a chance to breathe again, to rebuild. But the process would be long and arduous. The scars Rook had inflicted were not just physical. They were embedded in the town's psyche, in its collective memory. He looked down at the small knot of townspeople gathered before him. Their faces were turned up to him, their expressions a complex mix of gratitude, awe, and a lingering apprehension. He was their savior, but he was also a man who had dealt in wholesale death, a figure as formidable and dangerous in his own way as Rook had been. "This town, it's yours again," Sample said, his voice carrying over the quiet street. "Guard it well." He saw understanding and a new resolve dawning in some of their eyes. Old Man Keller stepped forward, Rook's badge still clutched in his hand. "We will, Marshal. And we thank you. You brought us back from the brink." His voice choked with emotion. Sample merely nodded, the gesture encompassing everything he couldn't or wouldn't say. He gathered the reins, his gaze sweeping one last time over the dusty street, the weathered buildings, the faces of the people who had endured so much. The nightmare for Cypress Hollow was indeed over. But as he turned his horse to leave, a cold premonition touched him, a whisper of unease that had nothing to do with his own wounds or the horrors he had faced. He had cut off the head of the snake in Devil's Den, but the coils of its evil might yet stretch further than he knew. With a final, almost imperceptible nod to the townsfolk, he nudged his horse into a slow walk, heading out of Cypress Hollow, the weight of his own reckoning settling upon him like the dust of the trail. Chapter 24. "Reckon you'll be headin' on soon, Marshal?" Patrick Murphy's voice, still bearing the quaver of long-held fear but now touched with a hesitant respect, broke the silence of the livery. He watched Eldridge Sample meticulously check the cinch on his bay gelding saddle. "Town owes you more'n it can say. More'n it'll ever rightly understand." Sample ran a hand down the gelding's flank, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his own scarred and battered hands. He had rested in Cypress Hollow for 2 days, his wounds slowly beginning to knit, the profound exhaustion in his bones easing slightly. He had eaten Keller's bland but nourishing food, slept in Murphy's relatively clean hayloft, and listened to the tentative, hopeful sounds of a town stirring back to life. But the ghosts of Devil's Den, the ashes of the Citadel, were a constant presence in his mind. "Just did my job, Murphy," Sample replied, his voice low. He avoided the old liveryman's grateful gaze. He wasn't one for accolades. The work was the thing, the rest was just noise. "Some jobs are bigger than others, Marshal," Murphy persisted quietly. Some take a toll that ain't easily seen." He gestured towards Sample's still bandaged arm, the gauntness of his face. Sample merely grunted, swinging up into the saddle. He was ready to leave Cypress Hollow to its fragile peace. His work here was done. Or so he thought. As he prepared to ride out, a thought nagged at him, a loose thread from before the bloody descent into the mountains. Deputy Collins, the one who had asked too many questions about Rook's bookkeeping and ended up scattered through Devil's Den. Rook's official office in the jailhouse. He hadn't had a chance to properly search it before Rook's escape. While the Citadel and its horrors were now ashes, the seat of Rook's legal corruption might still hold secrets. It was a long shot, but Sample was a man who believed in tying off loose ends. "One last piece of business, Murphy," he said, dismounting. "Keep an eye on my horse." He walked back towards the squat stone jailhouse, the townsfolk watching him with their now familiar mixture of awe and trepidation. The building felt cold, empty, haunted by Billy Hawkins's brief, tragic tenancy and Rook's monstrous betrayal. The main office was as he remembered it from his confrontation with Rook: stark, functional, with a heavy oak desk and a few battered chairs. Rook's personal effects had likely been minimal. His true life lived in the mountain fastness. But a sheriff, even a corrupt one, had paperwork. Sample began a methodical search of the desk. Most of it was mundane: old warrants, county notices, tally sheets for supplies. Then, in a locked drawer he had to pry open with the tip of his knife, he found it: a slim, leather-bound ledger, different from the one he'd seen Rook consult before. This one was not a record of local taxes or extortion from Cypress Hollow's businesses. Its entries were more cryptic, written in a code of sorts: names of other towns, dates, and figures that were too large for simple fines or fees. He saw Sheriff Buckner, Millwood County 50% share monthly, and Deputy Stroud, Pinetop Crossing, transport fees, and Justice Coates, Redwater special levies. The names and places spanned 3 counties, a network of seemingly legitimate lawmen, all apparently connected by these clandestine payments, all flowing towards Rook, or perhaps through him to some higher, unseen authority. A cold understanding began to dawn in Sample's mind. Rook's evil hadn't been an isolated pocket of depravity confined to Devil's Den and Cypress Hollow. It was a branch, a particularly rotten one, but still just a branch of a much larger, more insidious tree. The protection rackets, the intimidation, the siphoning of funds, it wasn't just Rook's personal greed. It was an organized system, a web of corruption that ensnared other men wearing badges, other officials sworn to uphold the law. He remembered the fear in Murphy's eyes when he'd first arrived, a fear that seemed disproportionate even to Rook's local tyranny. He recalled the hushed whispers about others who had crossed men of the law in distant settlements and met with accidents. The pieces began to click into place, forming a disturbing, ugly picture. The Ozark Mountains, wild and remote, a haven for those fleeing the law, had also become a breeding ground for a different kind of lawlessness, one that wore a badge and cloaked itself in authority. Sample leaned against the desk, the ledger heavy in his hand, a profound weariness settling over him, deeper than just physical exhaustion. He had won a savage battle, had cut down a brutal tyrant and scattered his clan. Cypress Hollow might be free, but the war was far from over. The evil he had confronted in Devil's Den was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a sickness that ran deep through the frontier, a network of wolves masquerading as shepherds. His victory here, hard won and paid for in blood and pain, suddenly felt diminished, like a single candle lit against an overwhelming darkness. There were other devils out there, other towns suffering under their own corrupt badges, other innocents living in fear. The scope of it was daunting, almost overwhelming. He thought of the settlers he had rescued, their haunted eyes. How many more like them were out there, their lives ruined, their faith in justice shattered by men like Rook and his confederates? Who was there to stand for them? The answer, grim and unbidden, settled in his own heart. Men like him. Men willing to walk into the darkness, to face the monsters, to pay the price. He closed the ledger, the weight of its implications pressing down on him. He could take it to Fort Smith, to Judge Parker. It would be evidence, certainly. But how deep did the rot go? Could even Parker's fierce justice untangle such a widespread conspiracy without plunging the entire territory into chaos? Or would it simply drive the corruption deeper underground, make it more cunning, more careful? He stood there for a long time, the silence of the empty jailhouse his only companion. The sun, climbing higher, cast a stark beam of light through the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, particles of the past, of forgotten injustices. His own psychological wounds, the memories of the cave, the brutal fights, the faces of the dead, were still raw. He had hoped, perhaps, for a respite, a moment to let the healing, both physical and mental, truly begin. But this ledger, this revelation denied him that. It was a new call to arms, a burden he knew with a weary certainty he could not refuse. The Ozark Mountains held more devils than just the Rook Clan, and his work here was far from done. With a scythe that seemed to carry the weight of the world, Eldridge Sample tucked the ledger into his saddlebag. He walked out of the jailhouse, his steps slow but resolute. He mounted his horse, his face set in grim lines. The people of Cypress Hollow, seeing him, perhaps sensed the change, the new somber purpose in his eyes. He was no longer just leaving a town behind. He was riding toward the larger, more dangerous horizon. He looked towards the rugged, blue-hazed peaks that loomed in the distance, a wilderness that hid both beauty and a profound, enduring darkness. Then, without a backward glance at the small, healing town, he urged his horse forward, towards the thunder he knew was gathering in those distant, beckoning hills.